They gave her 12 cents and a death sentence wrapped in feathers. 11 sick hens, scabbed, wheezing, half-rotted with disease, and every soul in Cinderbluff laughed the day Lenora Vale dragged that broken crate through the mud. They called her foolish. They called her desperate. They looked at her body, heavy, slow, wide as the prairie, and decided they already knew everything about her mind. But what Lenora Vale built from those 11 dying birds would bring an entire frontier settlement to its knees. And the people who laughed the loudest? They'd be the first ones begging for her help. Hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. And stay with me until the very end. Because this woman's journey will change the way you see strength forever. The wind came down from the north like a punishment. It howled between the wooden storefronts of Cinderbluff, stripped the last brittle leaves from the cottonwood trees along the creek, and drove the cold so deep into the ground that even the dogs stopped barking and crawled beneath the porches to wait it out. The sky had gone the color of old iron, flat, gray, heavy, with the kind of clouds that didn't promise snow but threatened something worse. Weeks of freezing rain, black ice on the footpaths, and the slow starvation that came when the land simply refused to give. It was the autumn of 1887, and Cinderbluff was dying. Not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily, the way a candle burns down in a room where nobody bothers to replace it. The mines that had drawn families westward 4 years earlier had produced just enough ore to fill the pockets of men who had already moved on to richer claims. What remained was a scattering of wooden buildings, a general store that smelled of kerosene and old flour, a livestock yard where animals stood in mud that never fully dried, and roughly 200 people who had come too far to turn back and didn't have enough money to go anywhere else. Lenora Vale stood at the edge of the livestock yard with her hands pressed flat against her thighs and her breath curling white in the November air. She was 40 years old, she was tall, nearly 5'10", and she was heavy. Not the kind of heavy that polite people pretended not to notice. The kind of heavy that made chairs creak, that made wagon boards groan, that made strangers stare and children whisper, and grown men nudge each other with their elbows when she passed. Her arms were thick, her hips were wide, her belly pressed against the front of her patched wool coat, and her face, broad, wind-burned, plain as bread, carried an expression that most people in Cinderbluff mistook for dullness. It was not dullness, it was patience. The kind of patience that watches and waits and records everything behind eyes that never blink at the wrong moment. Lenora had been standing at the fence for nearly 20 minutes, watching the livestock agent, a thin, irritable man named Poole, drag a wooden crate toward the burn pile at the back of the yard. Inside the crate, 11 chickens sat in a tangled heap of feathers, scabs, and labored breathing. Some had mites so deep in their skin that patches of raw flesh showed through the feathers. Others wheezed with every breath, their beaks slightly open, their eyes half closed. One hen, smaller than the rest, sat perfectly still with her head tilted at a sharp angle, watching Lenora through the slats of the crate with an expression that was almost intelligent. "Mr. Poole," Lenora said. Poole didn't stop walking. "Burning them before the sickness spreads. You'd best stand back, Mrs. Vale. Don't want you catching nothing." "Chickens don't give their diseases to people, Mr. Poole." "That's so." He spat into the mud without looking at her. "Well, I ain't taking chances. These birds are finished. Every one of them." "How much?" Poole stopped. He turned around slowly, the way a man turns when he's heard something so stupid that he wants to make sure he's looking directly at the source. "How much for what?" "The birds." Poole stared at her. His eyes dropped to her midsection, traveled the full width of her body, and came back up to her face with the particular expression that Lenora had been seeing on people's faces for as long as she could remember. The expression that said, "I have already decided what you are." "Ma'am, these chickens are half dead." "I can see that. They got mites, they got the wheeze. 2 of them probably won't last the night." "I understand." "Then why in creation would you want to buy 11 dying chickens?" Lenora reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small cloth purse. She opened it carefully and counted the coins inside. 12 cents. Every cent the Vale family had left until Bram's next lumber payment came through. If it came through at all. 12 cents, she said, for the crate and the birds. Poole looked at the coins. He looked at the chickens. He looked at Lenora. At the full, undeniable size of her standing there against the gray sky like a mountain that had wandered into town. And he laughed. Not a kind laugh. Not a surprised laugh. The laugh of a man who has just been handed a story he cannot wait to tell. 12 cents, he repeated, for 11 dead chickens. He shook his head and waved his hand toward the crate. Take 'em. Hell, take the crate too. Save me the trouble of burning it. He was still laughing when Lenora bent down, gripped the crate with both hands, and lifted it against her body. The walk from the livestock yard to the Vale property was just under half a mile. It took Lenora almost 40 minutes. The crate was heavier than it looked. The wood was waterlogged, and the birds, sick as they were, shifted and scrambled every time she adjusted her grip, throwing off her balance. The mud along the main road had frozen into uneven ridges that caught her boots at odd angles, and twice she had to stop and set the crate down on a fence post to rest her arms and catch her breath. Both times, people saw her. The first was Calvin Jessup, who ran the dry goods counter at the general store. He stepped out onto the porch with a broom in his hand, saw Lenora standing in the road with a crate of dying chickens pressed against her broad stomach, and called back through the open door to his wife. "Martha, come look at this. The Vale woman bought Poole's sick birds." Martha Jessup appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at Lenora. She looked at the crate. She pressed her lips together in the thin, satisfied line of a woman who has just had her lowest opinion of someone confirmed. "That woman can't even manage her own plate," Martha said, loud enough for Lenora to hear. "Now she thinks she's a chicken farmer." Lenora picked up the crate and kept walking. The second time she stopped, it was in front of the blacksmith's shop, where 3 men sat on overturned buckets sharing a jar of corn whiskey. One of them, a broad-shouldered cattleman named Harlan Briggs, pointed at her with the mouth of the jar. "Hey boys, look at that. Lenora Vale's gone and bought herself some company. 11 birds that look about as healthy as she does." The men laughed. One of them slapped his knee. Another made a clucking sound and flapped his elbows. Lenora did not look at them. She adjusted the crate, set her jaw, and walked the remaining quarter-mile to her property without stopping again. The Vale homestead sat at the eastern edge of Cinder Bluff, where the settlement's last row of fence posts gave way to open scrubland and the low, rolling hills that stretched toward the mountains. It was not much. A 2-room cabin with a patched roof, a well that produced water so cold it made your teeth ache, and a small collapsing shed that had once been used to store firewood but now stood empty, its door hanging from a single hinge. Bram Vale was splitting logs beside the cabin when Lenora came around the bend in the path. He was 43 years old, lean, weather-beaten, and quiet in the way that certain men become quiet after years of working with their hands. Not because they have nothing to say, but because they have learned that most words cost more than their worth. He had married Lenora 17 years ago in a small ceremony in Missouri, and in all those years he had never once made a joke about her weight, never once suggested she eat less, and never once looked at her with the expression that strangers wore when they saw her for the first time. He looked at her now with a different expression entirely. Curiosity. He set the axe head down in the chopping block and walked toward her, pulling off his gloves. "What have you got?" Lenora set the crate down in front of the shed. She was breathing hard. Her forearms were shaking from the effort of carrying the load, and her cheeks were flushed dark red from the cold and the exertion. But her eyes, those steady, watchful, endlessly patient eyes, were sharp. 11 chickens, she said. Bram looked into the crate. He saw the mites. He saw the raw patches. He heard the wet, rattling sound of the wheeze in their lungs. He counted the birds, some huddled together, others lying on their sides. And he saw the small, sharp-eyed hen sitting upright in the corner, watching him the way a schoolteacher watches a student she hasn't decided about yet. "They're sick," he said. "Yes." "How much?" 12 cents. Bram was quiet for a long time. 12 cents. Their last 12 cents. He had been planning to use that money for salt. They were almost out. And for needles, because Lenore's sewing kit had worn down to 2 bent pins, and winter was coming in fast. 12 cents wouldn't buy much, but it would buy something, and something was the difference between managing and not managing when you lived this close to the edge. He looked at the chickens again. He looked at Lenora. And instead of saying any of the things that a different kind of husband might have said, "What were you thinking? We needed that money. You've lost your mind," Bram Vale asked the only question that mattered. "What's your plan?" Lenora's plan began with the shed. That evening, while Bram reinforced the door and patched the worst gaps in the walls with scraps of canvas and old flour sacks, Lenora carried the crate inside and began sorting the birds. She did not sort them by size or by color or by any method that the livestock keepers of Cinderbluff would have recognized. She sorted them by illness. 3 birds had mites, deep, burrowing mites that had eaten into the skin beneath their feathers and caused open sores that wept and crusted over. Lenora placed these 3 in the far corner of the shed, separated from the others by a low barrier made from a broken shelf board. 4 birds had the wheeze, a respiratory illness that made their breathing sound like air being forced through a wet rag. These she placed near the door, where the airflow was better, and she propped the door open just enough to let fresh air circulate without letting in the worst of the cold. 2 birds were simply starving. Their breastbones jutted out like knife blades beneath their feathers, and their legs were so thin that Lenore could feel every tendon when she picked them up. These she placed together near a shallow dish of water mixed with a small amount of salt. The remaining 2, including the sharp-eyed hen from the corner of the crate, showed multiple symptoms: mild wheeze, early mites, and moderate weight loss. Lenora placed them in the center of the shed, where she could watch them most easily, and gave them their own food dish. Then she opened her notebook. It was a battered, water-stained journal with a cracked leather cover and pages so thin that the pencil marks on one side showed through to the other. Lenora's grandmother, a woman named Edith Pace, who had raised livestock in the hills of Kentucky before the war, had kept a similar notebook, and Lenora had grown up watching her grandmother record every symptom, every treatment, every change in an animal's behavior with the same careful attention that a doctor might give to a human patient. Edith Pace had believed something that most farmers considered foolish, that animals told you everything you needed to know, if you were patient enough to watch and honest enough to write down what you saw instead of what you expected to see. Lenora had inherited that belief along with the notebook. She wrote the date at the top of the first page. Then she described each bird, its size, its weight, estimated by feel, the condition of its feathers, the sound of its breathing, the color and consistency of its droppings, and its behavior, whether it was alert, listless, fearful, or aggressive. For the sharp-eyed hen, she wrote small, thin but not starved, feathers rough but not broken, mild wheeze, clears when she moves, watches everything, does not panic when handled, possible leader if she recovers. Beneath that, she wrote a single word: copper. It was past midnight when Lenora finally came inside. Bram had left a plate of cornbread and a cup of lukewarm broth on the table. She sat down heavily in the chair. It groaned beneath her, as chairs always did, and ate slowly, staring at the wall. 2 of them might not make it, she said. Bram was lying on the bed with his arm over his eyes, but he wasn't asleep. Which 2? The smallest of the mite birds, and the one with the worst wheeze. Their bodies are too far gone. And the others? Lenora was quiet for a moment. The others will live, she said, if I do this right. Then do it right. She looked at him across the small, cold room, this man who had never once treated her size as a flaw or her knowledge as a joke. And something moved behind her eyes. Not tears. Lenora Vale did not cry easily, but something deep and steady, like the current beneath a frozen river. I intend to, she said. The first week was brutal. Lenora woke before dawn every morning, pulled on her boots, and walked to the shed in darkness so thick she could feel it pressing against her skin. She checked each bird by lantern light, recording changes in temperature, breathing, appetite, and movement. She mixed treatments from memory, wood ash and lard for the mites, steam from boiling water and dried herbs for the wheeze, gradual increases in feed for the starving birds. And she adjusted every treatment based on what the notebook told her. On the 3rd day, the smallest mite bird died. Lenora found it lying on its side in the corner, its body already stiff, its eyes half open. She picked it up carefully, carried it outside, and buried it behind the shed in ground so hard she had to use the axe to break through the frozen topsoil. On the 5th day, the bird with the worst wheeze stopped breathing in the middle of the night. Lenora heard the silence, the absence of that terrible wet rattle, and knew before she reached the shed what she would find. She buried that one next to the first. 9 birds remained. But on the 6th day, something changed. The mite bird's sores began closing. The raw patches of skin, which had been weeping and crusted for days, started showing the faint pink of new growth beneath the edges. Lenora recorded this in the notebook with a hand that trembled slightly. Not from cold, but from the particular kind of relief that comes when you have gambled everything and the first sign appears that you might not lose. On the 7th day, the wheezing birds breathed clearly for the first time. One of them, a brown hen with a torn comb, actually stood up, walked to the food dish, and ate with an appetite that made Lenora laugh out loud in the freezing shed. And Copper, the sharp-eyed hen who watched everything, began doing something that Lenora had hoped for but hadn't dared to expect. She began organizing the other birds. It was subtle at first, a nudge here, a soft cluck there. When the starving birds hesitated at the food dish, Copper walked over and ate beside them until they joined. When the mite birds huddled together in the corner, Copper settled near them. Not too close, but close enough that her presence seemed to calm their restless scratching. When one of the wheezing birds became agitated and started flapping against the walls, Copper positioned herself between the panicked bird and the others, standing perfectly still until the flapping stopped. Lenora wrote in the notebook, "Copper has assumed leadership. She monitors the flock. She adjusts her behavior based on the condition of individual birds. She is not the strongest or the largest, but she is the most aware." Beneath that, Lenora added, "Awareness is the most undervalued quality in any living creature, including people." By the 3rd week, word had begun to spread through Cinder Bluff, not as news, but as gossip. The story of Lenora Vale and her 12-cent chickens had become the settlement's favorite joke. People told it at the general store, at the blacksmith shop, at the small church on Sundays, and around kitchen tables where families gathered to complain about the cold and the mud and the slow collapse of everything they had come west to build. The story always went the same way. Did you hear about the Vale woman? Spent her last 12 cents on 11 dying chickens. Poole was going to burn them, and she took them home like they were prize hens. Can you imagine? A woman that size carrying a crate of half-dead birds through the mud? Lord, what a sight! And always the punchline. If she can't manage what goes into her own body, what makes her think she can manage a flock? Agnes Rusk heard the story and did not laugh. She frowned. Agnes was 54 years old, thin as a fence rail, and hard in the way that the frontier made certain women hard. Not mean exactly, but rigid, brittle, certain of the rules she had built her life around. She had kept livestock in Cinder Bluff longer than anyone else. Her breeding flock, 12 Rhode Island Reds with bloodlines she could trace back 3 generations, was the most valuable collection of poultry in the settlement, and she guarded her reputation as fiercely as she guarded her birds. When Agnes heard that Lenora Vale's surviving chickens were not only alive but apparently recovering, she walked to the fence line between their properties and stood there for a long time, watching the smoke rise from the shed's patched chimney. "That woman doesn't know the first thing about livestock," Agnes told her neighbor, a tired-looking woman named Clara Dunn. "She's never raised a bird in her life. Whatever she's doing in that shed, it won't last." Clara shrugged. "Poole said those birds were finished. If she got 9 of them to live, that's more than most could manage." "Most don't have to manage," Agnes said sharply. "Most people buy healthy stock and keep them properly. They don't gamble their last pennies on animals that belong on a burn pile." Maybe she saw something the rest of us didn't. Agnes turned and looked at Clara with an expression that made the younger woman take a half-step backward. "Let me tell you something about Lenora Vale," Agnes said, her voice dropping to the low, flat tone she used when she wanted to be taken seriously. "I have been keeping birds for 22 years. 22 years of breeding, feeding, culling, and learning from my own mistakes. That woman has been in this settlement for 3 years, and before that she was a farmer's wife in Missouri who never raised anything more complicated than a kitchen garden. She has no training, she has no experience. And frankly, Clara, look at her. A woman who cannot discipline her own body has no business telling the rest of us how to care for our animals." Clara said nothing, but she noticed that Agnes kept looking toward the Vale property for a long time after the conversation ended. The first farmer came to Lenora's door on a Tuesday evening in early December. His name was Tom Hadley, and he was a small, nervous man with a wife, 4 children, and a flock of 30 laying hens that had slowly, inexplicably stopped producing eggs over the past 2 months. He stood on Lenora's porch with his hat in his hands, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, and he could not quite bring himself to look her in the eye. "Mrs. Vale, I heard you might know something about chickens." Lenora was standing in the doorway with a dish towel over her shoulder. The lamplight behind her cast her shadow wide and dark across the porch boards. She looked at Tom Hadley, at his nervous hands, at the shame on his face, at the desperation he was trying very hard to hide, and she understood immediately why he had come at night when no one would see him. "Come in, Mr. Hadley." He sat at her kitchen table and told her everything. The hens had been healthy through the summer, good layers, all of them. Then around September, production started dropping. 1 egg less here, 2 less there. By October, he was getting maybe half of what he expected, and by November, some of the hens had stopped laying entirely. He checked for mites. He checked for disease. He changed their feed twice. Nothing worked. Lenora listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked a series of questions that surprised him. "Where's your water trough in relation to the coop?" "Right outside the door." "Why?" "How many times a day do your children go into the coop?" Tom blinked. "The kids? I don't know. 3, 4 times? They like to collect the eggs." "Do they run when they go in? Do they shout? Do they chase the birds?" "They're children, Mrs. Vale. That's what children do." "What time do you feed in the evening?" "Whenever I get around to it. Sometimes before dark, sometimes after." Lenora nodded slowly. She opened her notebook and turned to a page near the back where she had written a list of observations under the heading, "Causes of Production Failure. Non-disease." "Mr. Hadley, your chickens aren't sick, they're stressed." "Stressed? They're chickens. They are living creatures with nervous systems, Mr. Hadley, and their nervous systems are telling them that their environment is dangerous." She ran her finger down the page. "Your water trough is too close to the coop. Every time an animal, a dog, a coyote, even a large bird, comes to drink, your hens hear it right outside their wall. They can't see what it is, so they assume the worst. That's disrupted sleep. Your children enter the coop multiple times a day, and based on what you've described, they enter loudly and unpredictably. That's chronic fear. And your feeding schedule is inconsistent, which means your hens don't know when food is coming, so they spend energy worrying about it instead of producing." Tom stared at her. "You're telling me my kids scared my chickens into not laying eggs?" "I'm telling you that fear, inconsistency, and disrupted sleep will shut down egg production in any bird. Move the water trough to the far side of the yard. Limit coop visits to twice a day, morning collection and evening feeding, and make sure whoever enters moves slowly and speaks quietly. Feed at the same time every evening. Give it 2 weeks." Tom left that night looking unconvinced, but he was desperate, and desperation makes people willing to try things they would otherwise dismiss. 2 weeks later, his hens were laying again. He told no one where the advice had come from, but his wife told her sister, and her sister told a friend, and within a month, 3 more families had come to Lenora's door after dark, each one carrying the same expression Tom Hadley had worn, the look of someone who needs help from a person they have been taught to look down on. A widow named Sarah Prescott brought records of her hens' declining health. She had been keeping track on scraps of paper, and Lenora spent 2 hours organizing the scattered notes into a coherent timeline that revealed the problem. Sarah's coop faced north, and the winter wind blew directly through gaps in the wall boards, dropping the temperature inside to levels that suppressed the birds' immune systems. Lenora drew her a diagram showing how to reposition the roosting bars and seal the gaps with mud and straw. A rancher named Dale Furman came with a different problem entirely. His cattle were weakening. Not sick exactly, but listless, losing weight, drinking less water than they should. Lenora had never worked with cattle, and she told Dale Furman so honestly. But she asked to see his pasture, and when she walked the fence line the next morning, slowly, breathing hard, stopping twice to rest, she noticed that his water troughs were positioned in the lowest part of the field, where runoff from the hillside collected in stagnant pools. "Your cattle aren't drinking because the water tastes wrong," she told him. "Move the troughs uphill, where the groundwater is cleaner, and clear that brush away from the south fence. They're avoiding that corner because they can't see what's hiding in it." Dale Furman was a big man with big opinions, and the idea of taking livestock advice from Lenora Vale offended him on a level he couldn't quite articulate. But he moved the troughs. He cleared the brush. His cattle started drinking again within 3 days. By January, Lenora's 9 surviving chickens were not just alive, they were thriving. Their feathers had grown back thick and glossy. Their eyes were bright. They moved through the small yard beside the shed with the confident, unhurried gait of animals that know exactly where their food is coming from and exactly when it will arrive. And they were laying eggs, not ordinary eggs. Lenora's eggs were rich, deeper in color, firmer in texture, with yolks so golden they looked almost orange. The shells were thick and hard, the kind of shells that don't crack when you tap them on the edge of a bowl, but break clean when you mean to break them. People who tasted them noticed the difference immediately, though most were reluctant to admit it. Bram began selling the surplus eggs at the general store, and Calvin Jessup, the same man who had called his wife to the porch to watch Lenora struggle through the mud, found that customers were asking specifically for the Vale eggs. He raised the price. They still sold out, but the community refused to credit Lenora. "It's the breed," Agnes Rusk declared when someone mentioned the quality of the eggs in her presence. "Those birds must have had good bloodlines before they got sick. It's got nothing to do with how she's keeping them." "Luck," said Harlan Briggs at the blacksmith shop. "Pure luck. Even a blind hog finds an acorn now and then." And Martha Jessup, who had never missed an opportunity to reduce another woman to her worst visible feature, said the thing that everyone else was thinking. "It's easy to fatten up chickens when you clearly know a thing or two about fattening." The laughter that followed carried across the street and through the walls of the general store, where Bram Vale was standing at the counter with a crate of eggs. He set the crate down. He looked at Calvin Jessup, and in a voice so quiet that Jessup had to lean forward to hear it, Bram said, "You will sell these eggs, and you will collect the money, and you will not repeat what your wife just said. Not because I'm threatening you, Calvin, but because one day soon you're going to need my wife's help. And when that day comes, you're going to want her to remember you as a man who chose silence over cruelty." Jessup sold the eggs. He said nothing to his wife about the conversation, and he never repeated Martha's joke, though he never told her to stop making them either. The idea came to Lenora on a cold evening in late January, while she sat in the shed with her notebook and watched Copper move through the small flock with the quiet authority of a creature that understood exactly what each bird around her needed. She would prove them wrong. Not with words, not with arguments, with evidence so clear that no amount of prejudice could explain it away. She would take her strongest bird, the one that best represented what her method could produce, and she would prepare it. Not with elaborate spices or fancy cooking, plain, simple, the kind of preparation that hides nothing and reveals everything about the quality of the animal itself. And she would ask Agnes Rusk to judge it, Agnes who had criticized her most harshly, Agnes, who had dismissed her knowledge, questioned her discipline, and used Lenora's body as evidence against her mind. Agnes, who was the only person in Cinder Bluff whose opinion about livestock actually carried enough weight to change what people believed. It was a risk. If Agnes declared the bird ordinary, the verdict would be final. Lenora's reputation, such as it was, would be buried alongside the two birds behind the shed. But if Agnes tasted that bird and couldn't deny what her own senses were telling her, Lenora looked at Copper. Copper looked back at her with those sharp, steady eyes, the eyes of a creature that had been marked for death and refused to die. "Not you," Lenora said quietly. "Never you." She chose instead a bird she had named Red, the brown hen with the torn comb who had been the first of the wheezing birds to stand up and eat. Red was healthy now, heavy with good muscle, her feathers the deep chestnut color that only comes from proper nutrition and low stress. She was not the best layer in the flock, but she was the strongest example of what Lenora's method could do. Take a dying animal and turn it into something that any farmer in the territory would be proud to own. Lenora closed the notebook. She would make the offer to Agnes tomorrow, but tomorrow never came the way she planned. Because that night, while Lenora slept and Copper roosted and the settlement of Cinderbluff pulled its blankets tighter against the deepening cold, something was already moving through the valley, silent, invisible, and devastating. The sickness had arrived. It started with a sound, or rather, it started with the absence of one. Dale Furman's cattle, the same cattle that had finally started drinking again after Lenora told him to move the troughs uphill, stopped calling in the mornings. For 3 years, Dale had woken to the low, steady lowing of his herd drifting across the frozen pasture, and the sound had become so ordinary that he never thought about it the way a man never thinks about his own heartbeat. But on the first Monday of February, When the temperature dropped so low that the water in the kitchen basin froze solid overnight, Dale Furman woke to silence. He found 4 of his cows standing in the far corner of the field with their heads down, their breath coming in short, shallow bursts that left barely a trace of vapor in the frozen air. Their eyes were glassy. Their nostrils were running with a thick, yellowish discharge he had never seen before. And when he put his hand on the nearest cow's flank, the heat coming off her body frightened him more than anything he had felt in 20 years of ranching. By noon, 2 more cows were showing the same symptoms. By evening, Harlan Briggs lost 3 chickens. He found them in the coop, not huddled together the way sick birds usually huddle, but scattered, as if each one had tried to get as far from the others as possible before collapsing. Their breathing was a wet, rattling gasp that sounded nothing like the ordinary wheeze Lenora had treated in her own flock months earlier. This was deeper, faster, the kind of breathing that meant the lungs were already filling with fluid, and the body was losing the fight to keep air moving through passages that were swelling shut. Briggs killed the 3 dead birds and burned them behind his barn. Then he checked the rest of his flock, 42 laying hens and 8 roosters, and found 11 more showing early symptoms: ruffled feathers, sluggish movement, discharge around the eyes. He told no one. He was Harlan Briggs. He had been raising chickens since before half the people in Cinder Bluff knew which end of an egg came out first, and he was not about to admit that something was happening in his coop that he couldn't handle. By Wednesday, he had lost 9 more birds. By Thursday, the sickness was everywhere. It moved through Cinder Bluff the way fire moves through dry grass, not in a single line, but in every direction at once, jumping from property to property, coop to coop, barn to barn, as if the cold itself were carrying it on its back. Tom Hadley's hens, the same hens that had just started laying again after Lenora's advice, stopped eating and began wheezing within 24 hours of each other. Sarah Prescott lost her best layer overnight and found 2 more lying flat on the roosting bars the next morning, too weak to lift their heads. The Jessup family's small flock of 12 birds dropped to 8, then 6, then 4 in the space of 3 days. And Agnes Rusk, Agnes, who had kept livestock longer than anyone, who had bred her Rhode Island Reds through 3 generations of careful selection, who had declared with absolute certainty that Lenora Vale knew nothing about animal care, woke on Friday morning to the sound of her prize hen gasping for air on the floor of the breeding coop. The settlement held a meeting that same evening in the back room of the general store. It was not a formal council meeting. Cinder Bluff's town council consisted of 5 men who met irregularly and made decisions that mostly involved arguing about road maintenance and well repairs. But the room was packed. Every family that kept livestock was represented, and the fear in the room was thick enough to taste. Lantern light threw long, jittering shadows across the walls, and the air smelled of wet wool, tobacco, and the sour edge of panic. Calvin Jessup stood behind the counter with his arms folded, looking at the crowd with the expression of a man who had appointed himself moderator and was already regretting it. "All right," he said. "We all know why we're here. Something's moving through our stock, and it's moving fast. I've lost 8 birds this week." "Harlan?" Briggs was leaning against the wall near the door, his jaw tight. 22, he said. The number fell into the room like a stone dropped into still water. People shifted in their seats. Someone's wife drew a sharp breath. "Dale?" Dale Furman stood up slowly. He was a big man, but tonight he looked shrunken, as if the crisis had taken something out of him that food and sleep couldn't replace. 6 head of cattle showing symptoms. 2 won't eat. 1 can barely stand. The room went quiet. "Has anybody seen anything like this before?" Jessup asked. Silence. Then Agnes Rusk's voice, thin and controlled, cutting through the stillness like a blade through cold butter. "I've seen respiratory illness before. I've treated it before. But not like this. This is faster. It's hitting birds and cattle both, and it's not responding to anything I know how to do." She paused. Her hands were folded in her lap, and Lenora, who was sitting in the back corner of the room, having come only because Bram insisted, noticed that Agnes's fingers were laced so tightly together that her knuckles had gone white. "I've lost 4 of my breeding flock, 4 birds I spent 2 years developing. If this doesn't stop, I'll lose them all." The room erupted, everyone talking at once, voices climbing over each other, fear turning to anger, turning to blame. Someone said the sickness must have come from the livestock agent's last shipment. Someone else said it was the water. A third voice suggested that the cold itself was to blame, that this winter was simply too harsh for the animals to survive. And then Councilman Edgar Marsh, a squat, red-faced man who owned the largest property in Cinder Bluff and had never missed an opportunity to remind people of that fact, said the thing that changed the direction of the entire evening. I hear the Veil woman's been keeping notes, some kind of notebook with treatments and observations. Information like that shouldn't be sitting in one person's shed. If she's got something that could help this settlement, the council should have access to it. The room went quiet again. People turned to look at Lenora. She was sitting on a wooden crate near the back wall. Her broad body settled into the space with the particular stillness that most people mistook for passivity. She had not spoken during the meeting. She had not raised her hand. She had simply sat and listened, the way she always sat and listened, with those steady, watchful eyes that missed nothing and revealed less. Bram, standing beside her with his arms crossed, felt the muscles in his shoulders tighten. "What exactly are you suggesting, Edgar?" Bram asked. Marsh spread his hands in the gesture of a man who wants to appear reasonable while saying something unreasonable. "I'm suggesting that this is a community crisis, and community resources should be available to the community. Mrs. Vale has been collecting information about livestock health for months. Good for her. But the rest of us have a right to that information too, especially now." "It's not community property," Bram said, his voice flat and hard. "It's my wife's work. She did it herself on her own time with her own knowledge. Knowledge she got by treating other people's animals," Marsh countered. "Animals that belong to families in this room. If she learned something from our livestock, we have a claim to what she learned." Lenora placed her hand on Bram's arm. He looked down at her. She shook her head, a small, almost imperceptible movement, and he unclenched his jaw and stepped back, though the anger in his eyes didn't fade. Lenora stood up. The room watched her rise, this large, heavy, broad-bodied woman unfolding herself from the crate with the slow deliberateness of someone who has learned that every movement she makes will be scrutinized, measured, and judged. She smoothed the front of her coat. She looked at Edgar Marsh. "Mr. Marsh," she said, and her voice was calm, steady, without a trace of the fear or anger that most people in the room were feeling. "My notebook is not a community resource. It is a record of my observations, my methods, and my grandmother's teachings. I built it with my own hands, and I will decide how it is used." Marsh's face reddened. "Now, Mrs. Vale, I don't think you understand the severity of—" "I understand the severity better than anyone in this room." Lenora's voice didn't rise, but something in it hardened, a quiet authority that made Marsh stop mid-sentence. "I've been watching this illness develop for 3 days. I've been tracking the symptoms in every flock I can observe from my property line. I know how fast it's moving, I know which animals are most vulnerable, and I have a reasonable idea of what's causing the spread." The room was absolutely silent. "Then tell us," Agnes said from her seat near the front. Her voice was strained. "If you know what's happening, tell us." Lenora looked at Agnes, at this woman who had dismissed her, belittled her, used her body as proof of her incompetence, and for a moment something passed between them. Not warmth, not forgiveness, but recognition. The recognition of one woman looking at another and seeing, perhaps for the first time, that the person standing in front of her was not what she had assumed. "I will do more than tell you," Lenora said. "I will show you, but I will do it my way, with my notebook under my direction. Not because I want control, Mrs. Rusk, because this illness will not wait for a committee to make decisions. We have days, not weeks, and if we do this wrong, half the livestock in Cinder Bluff will be dead before the snow melts." Nobody argued, not because they agreed with her, not because they respected her, but because they were afraid, and afraid people will follow anyone who speaks with certainty, even a woman they had spent months laughing at. Lenora began at dawn the next morning. She started with the worst cases, the animals that were closest to dying, and she worked outward from there, property by property, coop by coop, barn by barn. Bram drove her in their wagon because the distances were too great for her to walk in the time she had, and because the cold was so savage that even Lenora's heavy body couldn't maintain warmth for more than 30 minutes in the open air. At each property, she did the same thing. She examined every animal. She checked the shelters, the ventilation, the bedding, the proximity of food and water, the number of birds or cattle per square foot. She asked questions. When did the first symptoms appear? Which animals showed signs first? Had anything changed recently? New feed? New birds introduced? Repairs to the coop? A predator sighting that might have caused panic? And she wrote everything down. Her notebook filled with pages of tight, precise handwriting, observations, measurements, connections. She mapped the spread of the illness across the settlement, and by the end of the first day she had identified something that no one else had noticed. The sickness had started on the western side of Cinder Bluff and moved east, following the direction of the prevailing wind. "It's airborne," she told Bram that night, sitting at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of her and a cup of cold coffee growing colder in her hand. "The primary transmission is respiratory, bird to bird, possibly bird to cattle through shared airspace. The coops on the western side got hit first because the wind carried the pathogen from the original source, probably a wild bird that passed through and roosted near Harlan's property." Bram sat across from her, watching her face in the lamplight. He could see the exhaustion in the lines around her eyes and the way her shoulders had begun to round forward. But he could also see something else, a sharpness, a focus, a burning clarity that he had only ever seen in her when she was doing the things she was born to do. "What do you need?" he asked. "I need to reorganize every shelter in the settlement. Better airflow to reduce concentration of the pathogen. Separation of sick animals from healthy ones. Complete separation, not just a fence between them. Changed feeding schedules to reduce stress and support immune response. And I need people to follow instructions exactly, without arguing, without improvising, without deciding they know better." She closed the notebook and looked at him. "And I need to treat Agnes's birds first." Bram's eyebrows rose. "Agnes, the woman who's been tearing you down since the day we got here?" "Agnes's breeding flock is the most genetically valuable livestock in this settlement. If we lose those birds, we lose bloodlines that took years to develop. The community will need those genetics when this is over." Lenora paused. "And if I save Agnes's birds, Agnes will have to acknowledge what I've done, publicly, in front of the same people who laughed at me. That changes everything, Bram. Not for my pride, for my authority. Because once this crisis is over, I need these people to trust my methods permanently, not just when they're scared." Bram looked at his wife for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he realizes that the person sitting across from him has been thinking 3 moves ahead while everyone else was still reacting to the first. "You're not just trying to save the animals," he said. "You're trying to save the settlement." "One follows the other," Lenora said. "It always has." She arrived at Agnes Rusk's property at first light the next morning. Agnes was standing outside her breeding coop with a shawl pulled tight around her thin shoulders, and a look on her face that Lenora had never seen there before. It took her a moment to recognize it, because Agnes had always worn expressions made of certainty and judgment, and the particular kind of hardness that comes from believing you have earned the right to look down on others. This expression was different. This was fear. "Mrs. Vale," Agnes's voice was hoarse, "I lost 2 more overnight. My best layer and one of the breeding hens. The others are getting worse." Lenora stepped past her without ceremony and entered the coop. The smell hit her immediately. The thick, sour smell of illness, of bodies struggling to breathe, of bedding that had absorbed too much moisture and too much disease. She knelt, slowly, carefully, because kneeling was hard on her knees and harder on her back, and began examining the surviving birds one by one. 8 remained. Of those 8, 5 were showing advanced symptoms: heavy discharge, labored breathing, refusal to eat. The other 3 were in early stages, still mobile, still eating, but with the telltale ruffled feathers and dull eyes that meant the illness had already taken hold. "How long since you changed the bedding?" Lenora asked without looking up. 4 days ago. It needs to be changed every day during an outbreak. The pathogen concentrates in the droppings and the moisture. Every hour these birds spend on contaminated bedding, they're breathing in more of what's killing them. Lenora pointed to the far wall. "That vent is sealed." "Why?" Agnes shifted uncomfortably. "I sealed it to keep the cold out. The temperature dropped below 0 last week, and I didn't want—" "You trapped the illness inside with them." Lenora's voice was not cruel, but it was direct, the voice of someone who does not have time to soften the truth. "The cold is not what's killing your birds, Mrs. Rusk. The air is. Open that vent. Open the one on the east wall, too. I know it seems wrong to let cold air into a coop full of sick animals, but they need airflow more than they need warmth right now. Agnes stared at her. For 22 years, Agnes Rusk had been the authority on livestock in Cinderbluff. For 22 years, she had made decisions about ventilation and bedding and feed based on her own hard-earned experience, and no one had ever walked into her coop and told her she was wrong. But her birds were dying. "What else?" Agnes asked, and the word cost her something. Lenora could hear it, the sound of pride cracking, just slightly, under the weight of necessity. "Separate the 5 worst cases from the other 3. Put the sick birds in your storage shed. Clean it out first. Fresh bedding, both vents open. Feed them separately. Warm water only. Change 3 times a day. I'll mix a steam treatment, boiling water with dried thyme and pine needles. And I need you to keep it going in the sick shed continuously. The moisture loosens the congestion in their lungs, and the oils help fight the infection. And the 3 that aren't as bad? Keep them here. Clean everything. Every surface, every roosting bar, every feed dish. Burn the old bedding. Don't compost it, burn it. And don't touch the sick birds and then touch the healthy ones without washing your hands in between. You'll carry the illness on your skin." Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she asked the question that had been sitting in the back of her mind since the meeting at the general store. The question she had been too proud to ask in front of the others. "How do you know all of this?" Lenore stood up slowly, pressing her hand against her lower back as her body protested the effort. She looked at Agnes with an expression that held no anger, no resentment, no satisfaction, only the calm, unshakable certainty of a woman who has spent her life being underestimated and has long since stopped caring about the opinions of people who judge her before they know her. "My grandmother raised livestock in Kentucky for 40 years, Lenora said. She couldn't read, and she never went to school, and people looked at her the same way you look at me, like she couldn't possibly know what she knew. But she watched, every day, every season, every year. She watched her animals the way most people watch other people's, for signs of trouble, for patterns, for the small changes that come before the big disasters. And she wrote it all down. Not in words, because she couldn't write. In pictures. In symbols. In a system she invented because no one had ever taught her the one that already existed." Lenore touched the cover of her notebook. "I learned her system. I translated it, and I've been adding to it ever since." Agnes said nothing for a long time. Then she turned toward the storage shed and said, without looking back, "Tell me what to clean first." They worked together for the rest of the morning, Agnes following Lenore's instructions with a precision and intensity that surprised them both. By noon, the sick birds had been moved, the coop had been scrubbed, the vents had been opened, and the first batch of steam treatment was filling the storage shed with the sharp, clean scent of thyme and pine. Lenora didn't stop at Agnes's property. She moved from farm to farm throughout the day, dividing the settlement's remaining farmers into teams. She assigned each team a set of tasks based on the specific conditions of their property: airflow improvements for some, feeding schedule changes for others, complete shelter reorganizations for the worst cases. She gave each team a sheet of paper torn from her notebook with instructions written in her clear, careful handwriting, and she told them the same thing she had told Agnes. Follow these instructions exactly. Do not skip steps. Do not improvise. Write down everything you observe, every change, every symptom, every improvement, every death. Bring your notes to me every evening. Some of them resisted. Harlan Briggs stood in the doorway of his barn with his arms crossed and his jaw set and told Lenora that he had been raising chickens since before she was born and he didn't need a woman, especially not a woman your size, telling him how to run his operation. Lenora looked at him evenly. "Mr. Briggs, you've lost 22 birds in 5 days. How many more can you afford to lose before you'll listen to someone who might be able to help you?" Briggs didn't answer, but he took the sheet of paper. The first day was chaos. The second day was exhaustion. The third day was agony. Lenora's body was not built for this kind of sustained physical effort. She knew that. She had always known that. Her knees ached after the first hour of walking. Her lower back seized up every time she knelt to examine a bird, and then forced herself upright again. Her feet, wide, flat, swollen from years of carrying more weight than her frame was designed to support, bled inside her boots by the second afternoon, and she wrapped them in strips torn from an old petticoat without telling Bram, because she knew he would insist she rest, and resting was not something she could afford to do. She worked from before dawn until well after dark. She moved between properties in the wagon, but at each stop she walked, through mud, through frozen slush, through manure and straw, and the bitter cutting wind that never seemed to pause. She carried buckets of clean water. She hauled contaminated bedding to burn piles. She held dying birds in her large, steady hands and felt their hearts flutter and fade and stop, and she recorded each death in the notebook with the same careful precision she gave to every recovery. People watched her. They watched the way they had always watched her, with that particular attention that large bodies attract. The attention that measures and calculates and draws conclusions that have nothing to do with the person inside the body. But now, for the first time, some of them were watching with something other than amusement or contempt. They were watching with confusion, because Lenora Vale was not supposed to be able to do this. She was the heavy woman, the slow woman, the woman who couldn't control her own appetite, who struggled to walk half a mile, who made chairs creak and wagon boards groan. She was supposed to be weak. She was supposed to collapse. Several men had said so openly, Harlan Briggs among them, predicting with casual certainty that a woman of her size couldn't possibly sustain this pace for more than a day. It was now the third day, and Lenora had not stopped. On the third night, she sat at Agnes Rusk's kitchen table. Agnes had offered her house as a base of operations, which was itself a concession that would have been unthinkable a week earlier, and reviewed the reports from every team. Bram stood behind her, reading over her shoulder, occasionally handing her a fresh cup of coffee when the one in her hand went cold. The numbers were turning, not dramatically, not miraculously, but turning. The death rate had slowed. The number of new cases had dropped. Animals that had been in early stages 3 days ago were stabilizing, and a few, a precious few, were showing the first signs of improvement. Agnes's breeding hens were among them. The 5 worst cases were still critical, but they were breathing more easily. The steam treatments were working, loosening the congestion, reducing the fluid in their lungs, giving their immune systems room to fight. 2 of the 5 had started eating again that afternoon. Small amounts, tentatively, but eating. Agnes stood in the doorway of her own kitchen, watching Lenora work, and the expression on her thin, weathered face was one that Lenora had never expected to see directed at her. It was respect. Not the comfortable, easy respect that comes from shared status or mutual admiration. The harder kind. The kind that has to fight its way through years of assumption and prejudice, and the deeply human reluctance to admit that you have been wrong about someone, not in a small way, but in the most fundamental way possible. Your hen, Agnes said quietly. The one you were going to have me judge. The demonstration. Lenora looked up from the notebook. Read. Is she still alive? She's healthy. She's in my coop, isolated from the outbreak. Agnes was quiet for a moment. When this is over, she said, when the animals are well, I want to taste that bird, the way you planned it, plain, no seasoning to hide behind. Lenora studied Agnes's face. She saw the effort behind the words, the cost of saying them. Why? Because I owe you an honest answer, and I think I owe you more than that. But the honest answer is where I'd like to start. Lenora nodded. She didn't smile. She didn't thank Agnes. She simply returned to the notebook and continued working, because there were still animals dying in Cinderbluff, and the crisis was not over yet, and Lenora Vale had never been the kind of woman who stopped to celebrate before the job was finished. On the 4th morning, Agnes's weakest breeding hen, a small dark bird with a crooked beak that Agnes had named Patience, stood up from the bedding, walked to the water dish, and drank. Agnes, who had not cried since her husband died 7 years earlier, stood in the doorway of the storage shed and pressed her hand over her mouth and said nothing for a very long time. By the 5th morning, the dying had stopped. Not everywhere, not completely. But the relentless tide that had swept through Cinderbluff for nearly a week, claiming birds and cattle with the indifferent efficiency of a reaper moving through a field, had finally slowed to something that resembled a current rather than a flood. The reports that came to Agnes's kitchen table that morning told a story that Lenora read with the careful skepticism of a woman who understood that illness, like fire, could appear extinguished while still burning underground. 14 farms had reported no new deaths overnight. 3 farms had reported improvements, animals eating again, breathing clearly, standing on their own. 2 farms had lost 1 bird each, But both losses were animals that Lenora had already marked in the notebook as unlikely to survive. She had written their descriptions in a column she labeled critical, not expected to recover, and she had told their owners the truth plainly, because Lenora believed that people deserved honesty about death the same way they deserved honesty about everything else. The settlement had lost, in total, 63 chickens and 5 head of cattle over the course of the outbreak. It should have been worse. Everyone knew it should have been worse. In the neighboring settlement of Harrow Creek, a similar illness had swept through the previous winter and killed nearly 80% of the poultry population. Cinderbluff had lost roughly 30%, a devastating number, but a survivable one. And the difference between those two figures could be traced, line by line, page by page, to the worn leather notebook that Lenora Vale carried in the deep pocket of her coat. She was sitting at Agnes's table reviewing the final morning reports when she heard the sound of a wagon pulling up outside. Not the familiar creak of Bram's wagon, but something smoother, better maintained, drawn by horses that moved with the well-fed rhythm of animals that had never missed a meal. She looked up. Through the window, she could see a black carriage with a canvas cover, and stepping down from the driver's bench was a man she had never seen before. He was tall, taller than Bram, which was unusual, and thin in the particular way that Eastern men were thin, not from hard work or hunger, but from the kind of careful living that involved tailored clothes and regular meals, and the confident expectation that the world would arrange itself around their comfort. He wore a dark wool coat with brass buttons, a hat that had never been rained on, and boots so clean they looked like they had been polished that morning, which, Lenora realized, they probably had. He stood beside the carriage for a moment, surveying the settlement with the expression of a man examining merchandise. Then he turned toward Agnes's house and walked up the path with the easy, purposeful stride of someone who had already decided how this conversation was going to go. Agnes opened the door before he knocked. "May I help you? I'm looking for a Mrs. Lenora Vale." His voice was smooth, educated, with the particular cadence of someone who is accustomed to being listened to. "I was directed here by a gentleman at the general store." "And who are you?" He reached into his coat and produced a card, an actual printed card, cream-colored, with black lettering so precise it looked like it had been stamped by a machine. He handed it to Agnes, who read it with the suspicious attention she gave to anything that came from east of the Mississippi. "Dorian Wexler," she read aloud, "Regional Representative, Continental Livestock Associates." She looked up at him. "Never heard of it." "We're based in Philadelphia. We specialize in livestock improvement, breeding programs, disease management, feed optimization. We work with farms and settlements across the Eastern Territories, and we're expanding westward." He smiled the careful smile of a man who has practiced it in mirrors. "I've heard some very interesting things about Mrs. Vale's work, and I'd like to discuss a business arrangement." Agnes glanced over her shoulder at Lenora, who was still sitting at the table. Their eyes met. Lenora's expression did not change. It remained steady, watchful, calibrated. But something in the slight tilt of her head told Agnes everything she needed to know about what Lenora thought of men who arrived in clean boots during the aftermath of a crisis they hadn't lifted a finger to help with. "Come in," Agnes said, stepping aside. Dorian Wexler entered the kitchen and removed his hat. He took in the room with a single sweeping glance: the rough wooden table, the stacks of handwritten reports, the jars of dried herbs on the windowsill, the cast-iron stove that radiated a heat so intense it made the air shimmer. And his eyes came to rest on Lenora. She watched him look at her. She knew what he was seeing because she had seen it 1,000 times, the recalculation. The moment when a person who has heard about Lenora Vale meets Lenora Vale and has to reconcile the intelligence they've been told about with the body they can see. Most people failed this test. Their eyes would widen, or narrow, or drop, and the respect they had assembled on the walk over would quietly dismantle itself behind an expression of polite surprise. Wexler was smoother than most. His face betrayed nothing. But Lenora noticed that he chose the chair farthest from hers and positioned himself at an angle that allowed him to address her without directly facing her, as if her body were a problem he could solve through geometry. "Mrs. Vale," he said, "thank you for seeing me. I understand you've been doing remarkable work here." "I've been treating sick animals," Lenora said. "Whether that's remarkable depends on your standards." Wexler smiled again. "Well, word has traveled. Your methods, the documentation, the systematic approach to treatment and prevention, the results, have attracted attention from people who understand the value of what you've developed. Continental Livestock Associates would like to explore a partnership. What kind of partnership? A simple one. We would purchase the rights to your method, the notebook, the treatment protocols, the observation system, and develop it into a program that we can distribute to farms and settlements across the Western Territories. You would receive a fair payment for your work, and your methods would reach far more people than you could reach on your own. Lenora leaned back in her chair. The wood groaned beneath her, and she did not miss the way Wexler's eyes flickered downward at the sound, a reflex so brief that most people would have missed it, but Lenora did not miss things. How much? She asked. We're prepared to offer $50. The number hung in the air. $50 was a significant amount of money in Cinder Bluff, more than most families saw in 3 months. It was enough to buy salt, needles, winter provisions, new boots, feed for the chickens, and repairs for the shed. It was enough to clear the small debt the Vales owed to the general store and still have money left over. It was also, Lenora understood immediately, a fraction of what her method was actually worth. And in exchange for $50, she said, what would you expect? Full ownership of the method, the notebook, the treatment records, the feeding protocols, everything. Continental Livestock Associates would develop the program, distribute it, and manage all licensing and training. You would, of course, be credited as the original developer. Credited. Acknowledged. In the literature, your name would appear in connection with the method. But I would have no control over how it's used. Control isn't really the right word, Mrs. Vale. We would manage the program. You would be free to continue your work here, of course, but the method itself would belong to Continental. Lenora was quiet for a moment. She looked at Wexler with the same expression she used when examining a sick animal. Patient, thorough, analytical. She was not angry. She was not offended. She was simply gathering information, the way she always gathered information, carefully, systematically, without allowing emotion to interfere with observation. And if I refuse? Wexler's smile changed. It was still a smile, but the warmth drained out of it the way color drains out of the sky before a storm. Mrs. Vale, I want to be direct with you. Continental Livestock Associates has resources and relationships that extend across the Western Territories. We work closely with territorial governments, settlement councils, and trade organizations. If we decide that a particular operation, however well-intentioned, poses a risk to the broader livestock industry, we have the ability to raise concerns through the appropriate channels. You mean the town council? I mean the appropriate channels. Lenora understood the threat perfectly. It was not subtle, and it was not meant to be. Wexler was telling her that if she refused to sell, his company would pressure the council to shut down her operation, or, at the very least, to seize her notebook under the same logic that Edgar Marsh had proposed at the meeting in the general store. Agnes, who had been standing near the stove with her arms folded throughout the entire conversation, spoke for the first time since Wexler had sat down. "Mr. Wexler," she said, and her voice carried the particular edge of a woman who has spent 54 years learning how to cut through pretense. "You arrived in this settlement 3 hours ago. You didn't come during the outbreak. You didn't help treat a single animal. You didn't lose sleep. You didn't haul contaminated bedding. You didn't kneel in the mud holding a dying bird in your hands. You showed up after the work was done in a clean coat with a business card, and you're sitting in my kitchen offering this woman $50 for something your entire company couldn't produce on its best day." She paused. "I've lived in Cinder Bluff long enough to recognize a man who wants to buy low from someone he assumes is desperate. And I'll tell you right now, you've misjudged the situation." Wexler's expression hardened. "Mrs. Rusk, I'm not sure this concerns... It concerns me because my animals are alive because of that woman. It concerns every family in this settlement. And if you think you can walk in here and threaten her with council pressure, you should know that I sit on that council's livestock advisory board, and I have a long memory." The room went very still. Wexler looked at Agnes. He looked at Lenora. And Lenora saw, behind his careful, practiced exterior, the first flicker of something he had not expected to encounter in a frontier settlement at the edge of nowhere. Resistance from someone he had already dismissed. "I appreciate the passion," Wexler said carefully, "but this is a business discussion, and I think it's best conducted between Mrs. Vale and myself." "Then conduct it," Lenora said. But you should know my answer before you waste more of your own time. I will not sell my method for $50. I will not sell it for $500. I will not hand over my notebook, my records, or my grandmother's knowledge to a company that had never heard of Cinderbluff until someone told them there was something here worth taking. She folded her hands on the table, large hands, rough-knuckled, with short nails and calluses that told the story of a life spent working. If you want to do business with me, Mr. Wexler, you will do it on my terms. And my terms are not what you came here expecting. Wexler stood. He put his hat on. He buttoned his coat with the precise, unhurried movements of a man who wants to project calm while his mind races. I'll be staying at the boarding house for a few days, he said. I'd encourage you to think carefully about this, Mrs. Vale. Opportunities like this don't come along often for someone in your position. My position, Lenora repeated. The words landed between them like a stone. Wexler met her eyes. For the first time, something in his expression shifted. Not quite respect, but the beginning of uncertainty. The beginning of the realization that the woman sitting in front of him was not who he had assumed she would be. He left without another word. Through the window, Lenora watched him climb back onto his carriage and drive toward the center of town, and she sat very still for a long time after the sound of his wheels had faded into the distance. Agnes sat down across from her. The two women looked at each other across the rough wooden table. Two women who had spent the better part of a year as adversaries, separated by pride and prejudice and the particular cruelty that women sometimes inflict on each other when they have been given so little power that they guard what they have with their teeth. You can't fight him alone, Agnes said. I know. He'll go to the council. Marsh will support him. Probably Jessup, too. I know. Then what are you going to do? Lenora opened the notebook. She turned to a clean page and began writing. Not treatment notes this time, but names. Names of families, names of farms, dates and outcomes. Every animal she had treated, every recommendation she had made, every life she had saved over the past 4 months, documented in her careful, precise handwriting with the dates and details that turned anecdotes into evidence. I'm going to build a case, she said, not for the council, for myself. By the time I sit down with Dorian Wexler again, I will have documentation from every farm I've worked with, signed statements, production records, treatment histories. I will have proof that my method works, proof that I developed it independently, and proof that no one, not Wexler, not the council, not anyone, has a legitimate claim to what I've built. She looked up at Agnes. And I will need your help. Agnes was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the notebook, at the pages and pages of observations, the careful diagrams, the columns of numbers and notes that represented not just knowledge, but the accumulated wisdom of 2 generations of women who had watched and listened and learned while the world told them they had nothing worth knowing. What do you need me to do? Agnes asked. I need you to talk to the families I've worked with. Tom Hadley, Sarah Prescott, Dale Furman, all of them. I need them to write down what happened, what their animal's condition was before I intervened, what I recommended, and what the results were. Dates, numbers, specifics. Not stories. Evidence. Some of them won't want their names attached. They came to you in secret. They were ashamed to be asking for help from... Agnes stopped herself. From a woman like me, Lenora finished. I know, but shame is a luxury we can't afford right now, Mrs. Rusk. Wexler isn't going away. He'll come back with a better offer or a harder threat, and when he does, I need to be holding something he can't argue with. Agnes stood up. She pulled her shawl tight and walked to the door. With her hand on the latch, she paused and looked back at Lenora with an expression that was complicated and raw. The expression of a woman who is in the process of dismantling something she built inside herself a long time ago and is discovering piece by piece how much of her identity was constructed on the wrong foundation. I said things about you, Agnes said, to Clara Dunn, to others. Things about your body, about what it meant about your character, about what it proved about your discipline. She paused. The words cost her visibly. Lenora could see the effort in the tightening of her jaw and the way her knuckles whitened around the latch. I was wrong, not mistaken. Wrong. There's a difference, and I'm old enough to know it. Lenora looked at her steadily. I heard what you said. Every word of it. This settlement isn't big enough for secrets. I know. And you're right that there's a difference between mistaken and wrong. Mistaken is accidental. Wrong is a choice. Agnes flinched. It was a small movement, barely visible, But Lenora saw it the way she saw everything, clearly, precisely, without flinching herself. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Agnes said. "Good, because I'm not offering it. Not yet." Lenora closed the notebook and placed her hands flat on the table. "What I am offering is the chance to do something useful with what you're feeling right now. Go talk to those families. Get me those statements. Help me protect what I've built. Not because you owe me, but because you understand now what it's worth." Agnes nodded once. She opened the door and stepped out into the cold morning air, and Lenora watched her walk across the frozen yard toward the road with the stiff, deliberate stride of a woman who has just been handed a task she intends to complete if it kills her. When Agnes was gone, Lenora sat alone in the kitchen for a long time. The stove ticked and popped as the fire settled. The reports lay spread across the table. 14 farms, dozens of animals, weeks of work compressed into pages of handwriting that only she could fully interpret. Outside the window, the sun was climbing above the hills to the east, throwing long shadows across the settlement and painting the frozen mud in shades of gold and amber that made even Cinderbluff look, for a few minutes, like a place worth fighting for. She was tired, the kind of tired that goes beyond sleep, beyond rest, beyond anything the body can recover from quickly. Her feet were still wrapped in the strips of petticoat she had torn 5 days ago, and when she had changed the wrappings that morning, the blisters underneath had been raw and weeping. Her back ached in a way that made every breath feel like a negotiation between her muscles and her spine. Her knees, those long-suffering joints that had carried her weight across every inch of this settlement for months, throbbed with a dull, constant pain that she had learned to push to the edges of her awareness, the way a person learns to push the sound of wind to the edges of hearing. But her mind was clear, clearer than it had been in months. The crisis had burned away everything unnecessary. The self-doubt, the anger, the quiet hurt that accumulated like dust every time someone looked at her body and decided they knew everything about her soul. What remained was the thing that had always been there, underneath the weight and the weariness and the endless small humiliations of living in a body that the world insisted on treating as a character flaw: certainty. She knew what her method was worth. She knew what her knowledge could do. And she knew, with the calm, absolute clarity that comes only to people who have been tested beyond their limits and discovered that their limits were further than anyone, including themselves, had believed that she was not going to let Dorian Wexler or Edgar Marsh or anyone else take it from her. Bram arrived at noon with a plate of food and a look on his face that told Lenora he had already heard about Wexler's visit. "Calvin told me," he said, setting the plate in front of her. Cold biscuits, a slice of salt pork, a jar of preserved apples. "Said some Eastern man in a fancy coat came asking about you at the store. He came here, made an offer. $50 for the notebook and the method." Bram sat down heavily. He looked at the plate. He looked at her. "What did you say?" I said no. "And?" "And he threatened to go to the council. Said his company could make things difficult for us if I didn't cooperate." Bram's jaw tightened. She could see the anger building behind his eyes. Not the explosive kind, but the slow-burning, structural kind that comes from a man who has spent his entire marriage watching the world undervalue the woman he chose and has never once been able to fix it with his hands. "What do you want to do?" he asked. Lenora pushed the plate toward him. "Eat half of this. You haven't had anything since breakfast." "Lenora, eat. Then listen." She waited until he picked up a biscuit. "Agnes is gathering statements from every family I've worked with. Signed accounts of what I did, what I recommended, and what the results were. I'm compiling the production records, the treatment logs, the feeding experiments, everything. By the time Wexler comes back, I will have a body of evidence that proves 3 things. My method works, I developed it independently, and no one has a legal or moral claim to it but me. And then I negotiate. Not from weakness, not from gratitude, from strength." Bram looked at her across the table. This woman he had married 17 years ago. This woman who had never been beautiful by anyone's definition and had never been small by any measurement. This woman who carried the weight of her own body and the weight of other people's contempt with the same quiet, immovable patience. And he saw something in her face that he had always known was there, but had never seen expressed this clearly. She was not fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for something bigger. For the right to be recognized not as the heavy woman who got lucky, not as the desperate wife who stumbled onto something useful, but as the person she had always been. A mind. A careful, systematic, observant, relentless mind that happened to live inside a body that the world had decided to use as evidence against it. "You're going to win," Bram said. It was not a question. Lenora picked up the remaining biscuit and ate it slowly, chewing with the deliberate concentration she gave to everything. "I'm going to prepare," she said. "Winning takes care of itself when the preparation is thorough enough." Over the next 6 days, while the settlement slowly recovered from the outbreak, and the animals regained their strength, and the cold loosened its grip just enough to remind people that spring was not a myth, but a promise, Lenora built her case. Agnes brought her the first statements within 48 hours. Tom Hadley's was the most detailed. He described his hen's decline, Lenora's diagnosis, her recommendations, and the results, all in the plain, factual language of a man who understood that he was writing something that might be read by strangers. Sarah Prescott's was shorter but equally specific. Dale Furman's was grudging and stiff, written in the handwriting of a man whose pride was still bruised, but the facts were there. His cattle had been declining, Lenora had identified the problems, and her recommendations had worked. Altogether, Agnes collected statements from 7 families, every family Lenora had helped, including 2 who had come to her during the outbreak rather than before it. Each statement was dated and signed. Each contained specific details, dates, symptoms, treatments, outcomes, that corroborated Lenora's notebook entries and confirmed the pattern she had been building for months. Lenora organized everything into a system. Production records from her own flock showing the trajectory from 11 dying birds to 9 healthy, productive hens. Treatment logs from the outbreak documenting her interventions across 14 farms and the resulting decline in mortality. Feeding experiments she had conducted on her own birds, comparing different schedules and compositions, and recording the effects on egg quality, shell strength, and overall health. And then, because Lenora Vale was not the kind of woman who left anything to chance, she did one more thing. She prepared Red, the brown hen with the torn comb, the first of the wheezing birds to recover, the living proof of what Lenora's method could do, was selected, killed, dressed, and prepared on a Thursday evening in late February. Lenora prepared her plainly. No elaborate seasoning, no heavy sauces. Salt, a small amount of wild thyme from the hillside, and slow roasting in the cast-iron Dutch oven that had been Lenora's grandmother's before it was hers. The smell filled the cabin and drifted out through the gaps in the walls and across the cold evening air, and Bram, who was splitting wood in the yard, stopped mid-swing and stood there with the axe resting on his shoulder, breathing in the scent of something so rich and so unmistakably good that it answered every question anyone had ever asked about whether Lenora Vale knew what she was doing. The next morning, Lenora sent word to Agnes. Agnes came alone. She arrived at the Vale cabin just after sunrise, wearing her best shawl and an expression that sat somewhere between anticipation and dread. The expression of a woman who knows she is about to encounter a truth she has spent a long time avoiding. Lenora met her at the door and led her to the kitchen table. The bird sat on a plain wooden platter in the center of the table, carved and arranged without decoration. Beside it, a single plate, a fork, and a cup of water. Agnes sat down. She looked at the bird. She looked at Lenora, who stood near the stove with her hands folded in front of her broad stomach, watching with the same patient attention she gave to everything. Agnes cut a small piece from the breast. She put it in her mouth. She chewed slowly. And then she closed her eyes. The silence in the cabin lasted a long time. Bram stood in the doorway, watching. Lenora stood by the stove, waiting. Agnes sat at the table with her eyes closed and her fork resting on the plate, and when she finally opened her eyes, they were bright with something that was not quite tears, but lived in the same territory. "How?" Agnes said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "How did you do this?" "The same way I do everything," Lenora said. "I paid attention." Agnes put down the fork. She placed both hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment. These thin, weathered, capable hands that had raised livestock for 22 years and had never produced a bird that tasted like the one sitting in front of her. "This is the best poultry I have ever tasted," Agnes said, "and I have been raising birds my entire adult life." She looked up at Lenora, and the last wall between them, the wall built of pride and prejudice, and the stubborn human refusal to see what is standing right in front of you, came down. Not with a crash, with a settling. The way a building settles when the ground beneath it finally decides to hold. This is not luck. This is not an accident. This is knowledge. The kind you don't get from books, and you don't get from men in clean coats with business cards. You got this from watching and caring and refusing to stop when everyone told you to quit. Lenora said nothing. She simply stood by the stove in her patched coat and her wrapped feet and her broad, heavy, aching body, and she let the truth sit in the room like a living thing breathing on its own, needing no defense. Agnes stood up. She pushed back her chair and faced Lenora across the small, warm kitchen. "When you meet with Wexler," Agnes said, "I want to be there, not to speak for you, to make sure everyone in that room understands exactly what they're dealing with." Lenora nodded once. Then she wrapped the remaining meat in cloth, placed it in the cold box, and opened her notebook to the page where she had been drafting her terms for the past 6 days because Dorian Wexler was coming back tomorrow, and Lenora Vale intended to be ready. Dorian Wexler returned on a Friday afternoon, and he did not come alone. Beside him in the carriage sat a second man, shorter, thicker, with a trimmed beard the color of iron filings and a leather case balanced on his knees that had the look of something that contained contracts. The second man did not introduce himself when they stepped down from the carriage outside Agnes Rusk's house. He simply stood 2 paces behind Wexler with the practiced invisibility of someone whose job was to witness, record, and produce documents at precisely the right moment. Lenora saw them coming from the kitchen window. She had been sitting at Agnes's table since early morning, reviewing her notes one final time, arranging the statements and production records in the order she intended to present them, and drinking coffee so strong that Bram had winced when he tasted it. Agnes stood near the stove. Bram leaned against the wall by the door. The 3 of them had been waiting in a silence that felt less like tension and more like the particular stillness that settles over a landscape just before the weather turns, charged, alert, inevitable. "He brought someone," Agnes said, watching through the window. Lenora did not look up from the notebook. "A lawyer or someone who functions as one. He'll have a contract ready, a revised offer, probably higher than $50, designed to make me feel like I've won something." "How do you know?" "Because that's what I would do if I were him, and I thought I was dealing with someone who could be flattered into surrendering." Agnes glanced at Lenora, at the calm, heavy-shouldered figure sitting at the table with her hands resting on either side of the notebook like a general resting her hands on a map, and shook her head slowly. "You are not what I thought you were, Lenora Vale. Not even close." "Few people are," Lenora said. "That's the problem with thinking you already know." A knock came at the door. Bram opened it. Wexler entered first, removing his hat with the same smooth courtesy he had displayed during his first visit. His eyes swept the room and registered the additions since last time. Agnes standing by the stove with her arms crossed, Bram positioned near the door with his hands at his sides, and the table itself, which was no longer covered with scattered reports, but organized with the precision of an exhibit. Stacks of papers, each one labeled and arranged. The notebook in the center, closed but prominent, and Lenora sitting behind all of it like a woman who had built a fortress out of paper and ink and was daring someone to breach it. "Mrs. Vale," Wexler said, "thank you for agreeing to meet again." "I didn't agree," Lenora said. "You told me you'd be back. Here you are. Sit down." Wexler sat. The second man, Chiechang, who Wexler introduced only as Mr. Greer, my associate, took the chair beside him and placed the leather case on the table with the careful positioning of a man who understood the theatrical value of documents. "I've given our previous conversation a great deal of thought," Wexler began. "I want to acknowledge that my initial offer may not have reflected the full value of what you've developed here. Continental Livestock Associates is prepared to improve our terms significantly." "I'm listening." $200 paid immediately upon signing, plus an additional $20 per year for 5 years as a consulting fee. In exchange, Continental would acquire full rights to the method, including the notebook, all treatment protocols, and the right to develop and distribute the program under our brand. He paused, watching her face the way a card player watches an opponent's hand. "That's $300 total, Mrs. Vale. More money than most families in this settlement will see in 2 years." The number filled the kitchen like smoke. $300. Lenora could feel its weight in the room, could feel Bram shifting against the wall behind her, could feel Agnes's fingers tightening around her own forearms. $300 would change everything. It would pay off every debt, secure the property, buy provisions for 2 winters, replace every worn-out tool and garment the Vales owned. It was the kind of money that turned desperation into stability, and Wexler knew it. He knew it because he had calculated it. He had arrived in Cinder Bluff, surveyed the poverty, estimated the threshold at which a frontier family's resistance would buckle, and set his offer precisely at that threshold. It was not generosity, it was engineering. Lenora recognized this because she understood systems. She understood how environments shaped behavior. In chickens, in cattle, in people. She understood that stress, fear, and deprivation changed the way a living creature made decisions. And she understood that Dorian Wexler was attempting to use those forces against her the same way a predator uses terrain against prey. She also understood that she was not prey. "Mr. Wexler," she said, "before I respond to your offer, I'd like to show you something." She opened the notebook. But instead of turning to her treatment logs or feeding protocols, she turned to the section she had built over the past 6 days. The section that Wexler had not expected, because Wexler had assumed that Lenora Vale was a talented but unsophisticated woman whose negotiating position began and ended with the word no. "These are signed statements from 7 families in Cinder Bluff," she said, placing the first stack in front of him. "Each statement describes the condition of their livestock before my intervention, the specific recommendations I provided, and the documented results, dates, numbers, and signatures." Wexler reached for the stack. Greer leaned forward. Lenora placed a second stack beside the first. "These are production records from my own flock. 9 birds, all recovered from near death, showing egg production, shell quality, weight gain, and health indicators over a 4-month period. The numbers demonstrate consistent improvement correlated directly with my feeding and management protocols." A third stack. "These are treatment logs from the recent outbreak. 14 farms, 63 birds, and 5 cattle lost, but over 200 animals saved through coordinated intervention based on my methods. Every treatment is documented. Every outcome is recorded." She placed a fourth and final set of papers on the table, thinner than the others, but written with a precision that even Greer, who spent his professional life reading contracts, could see was deliberate. "And these," Lenora said, "are my terms." Wexler looked at the stacks of paper arranged in front of him. He looked at Lenora, and for the first time since arriving in Cinder Bluff, the careful architecture of his confidence showed a crack. "Your terms," he repeated. "Equal ownership of any licensed program derived from my method. Not a consulting fee, not a one-time payment. Equal ownership. 50% of all revenue generated by the program paid quarterly in perpetuity." Wexler's mouth opened. Lenora continued before he could speak. "Guaranteed yearly income of no less than $100, independent of licensing revenue, to ensure that my family is not dependent on your company's performance or honesty." Greer's pen, which had been hovering above a blank page in his notebook, went still. "Full creative and operational control over my original method. Continental may develop derivative programs, but my notebook, my protocols, and my treatment system remain my intellectual property. They cannot be altered, rebranded, or distributed without my written consent." Wexler leaned back in his chair. His expression had shifted from surprise to something harder. Not anger exactly, but the cold reassessment of a man who has walked into what he thought was a simple transaction and discovered that the other party has been preparing for war. "And one more thing," Lenora said. "Free training. Any struggling frontier family, widows, poor farmers, laborers, anyone who cannot afford to pay for the program, receives training at no cost. That condition is non-negotiable, and it applies for the life of the agreement." The kitchen was silent. The stove ticked. The wind pressed against the windows. Bram stood by the door with his arms at his sides and his eyes fixed on Wexler's face, watching the way a man watches a rattlesnake that has just been told it's in someone else's territory. Wexler picked up the first stack of statements and read through them slowly. His eyes moved line by line, page by page, and Lenora watched him absorb the weight of what she had built. Not just the evidence, but the implication of the evidence. This was not a notebook full of folk remedies and lucky guesses. This was a systematic, documented, reproducible method that had been tested across multiple farms, multiple animal types, and a full-scale health crisis, and the results were undeniable. He set the statements down and looked at her. Mrs. Vale, I appreciate the work you've done here. It's impressive. But what you're asking for is, frankly, unprecedented. Continental Livestock Associates does not enter into equal partnerships with individual operators. We acquire methods, we develop programs, and we distribute them through our network. That's how the business works. Then change how the business works, Lenora said. It's not that simple. It is exactly that simple. You came here because your company cannot reproduce what I've developed. You admitted as much during our first conversation. Not in words, but in the fact that you traveled 500 miles to sit at this table. If Continental could develop this method independently, you would not be here. You would not need me. Wexler said nothing. You are not buying a product, Mr. Wexler. You're trying to buy a mind. And the mind attached to this method is not for sale at any price. What is available, under the terms I've described, is a partnership, a real one that respects the value of what I've created and ensures that the people who need it most are not priced out of access. Greer cleared his throat. Mr. Wexler, perhaps we should discuss this privately. No, Wexler said. He was still looking at Lenora. His eyes had narrowed, but not with contempt, with the particular intensity of a man who is recalculating an equation he thought he had already solved. No, I want to hear this. All of it. You've heard all of it, Lenora said. Equal ownership, guaranteed income, full creative control, free training for those who can't pay. Those are my terms. They are not a starting position. They are not an invitation to negotiate downward. They are the conditions under which I will allow my life's work to be distributed beyond this settlement. And if I refuse? Lenora closed the notebook. The sound was small, just the soft press of leather against paper. But in the silence of the kitchen, it carried the weight of a door closing. If you refuse, she said, you will return to Philadelphia and tell your company that you failed to acquire the method. Another representative will come, maybe in 6 months, maybe in a year. By then, my method will have spread to neighboring settlements through word of mouth. Families I've trained will teach other families. My reputation will grow without your help, without your brand, and without your money. And when your company finally realizes that the method is spreading beyond your reach, you will send someone back to this table with the same offer I'm making today, except by then, my terms will be higher. She placed her hands flat on the table, those large, rough, capable hands, the hands that had carried a crate of dying chickens through the mud, the hands that had held sick birds in freezing barns, the hands that had written every page of the notebook that Dorian Wexler wanted so badly. You did not travel this far because of my appearance, she said, and her voice was steady, unhurried, and absolutely certain. You came because your company cannot reproduce what is written in these pages. You know it. Mr. Greer knows it. I know it. The only question is whether you are wise enough to accept a fair partnership or foolish enough to walk away from one. The silence that followed lasted a long time. Wexler sat in his chair and looked at the stacks of evidence on the table. He looked at the notebook. He looked at Lenora, at the full, undeniable reality of her, this woman who was everything he had not expected and nothing he had prepared for. He had come to Cinder Bluff expecting desperation. He had found something else entirely. He had found a woman who understood her own value. Wexler turned to Greer. The two men exchanged a look, the kind of look that passes between professionals when the situation has exceeded the boundaries of the plan they arrived with. Greer opened his leather case and produced a blank sheet of paper. He placed it on the table and uncapped his pen. Let's go through the terms, Greer said quietly. One by one. They worked for 3 hours. Lenora did not yield on a single major point. When Wexler pushed back on the equal ownership provision, arguing that Continental's distribution network and existing relationships justified a larger share, Lenora pointed to the production records and the outbreak treatment logs and asked him to identify which of those results had been produced by Continental's network. When Greer suggested reducing the guaranteed income to $75 per year, Lenora explained, with the patient precision of a woman who had been balancing a household budget on the edge of nothing for years, exactly how much it cost to maintain a frontier operation and exactly how little $75 would cover. When Wexler questioned the free training provision, arguing that it undermined the program's commercial value, Agnes spoke for the first time since the negotiation had begun. Mr. Wexler, I have been keeping livestock in this settlement for 22 years. I have watched families lose their animals and their livelihoods because they couldn't afford advice that would have cost someone like you nothing to provide. The free training provision isn't charity, it's the foundation. If you build a program that only reaches people who can already afford help, you haven't solved anything. You've just found a new way to profit from the same problem. Wexler looked at Agnes. He looked at Lenora. He looked at the stacks of evidence on the table. The signed statements, the production records, the treatment logs, the feeding experiments. And he understood, finally and completely, that he was not dealing with an uneducated frontier woman who had gotten lucky with some chickens. He was dealing with someone who had built something his entire company, with all its resources and all its expertise, could not replicate. And she knew it, and she had known it long before he walked through the door. Equal ownership, Wexler said slowly, as if tasting each word. Guaranteed income of $100 per year. Full creative control. Free training for qualifying families. He paused. Continental will want a right of first refusal on any future developments. Lenora considered this. Agreed. First refusal with a 30-day window to match any outside offer. After 30 days, the right expires. Wexler nodded. He turned to Greer. Draw it up. Greer wrote for another hour. Lenora read every word of the draft agreement, asking questions about language she didn't understand, and insisting on changes to 3 clauses that she felt were ambiguous. Wexler watched her read with the expression of a man who was still adjusting to the reality of the situation, still processing the distance between the woman he had expected to find and the woman he had actually found. When the document was complete, Greer produced a clean copy. Wexler signed it first, with the quick practice signature of a man who signed dozens of documents a week. Greer signed as witness. Then Lenora picked up the pen. She held it for a moment, looking at the document. Her name was printed at the bottom in Greer's neat handwriting, Lenora Vale, and above it, a blank line waiting for her signature. She thought about the 12 cents she had spent on 11 dying chickens. She thought about the mud and the laughter and the crate pressed against her body and the sound of Martha Jessup's voice carrying across the street. She thought about Copper, sitting on the roosting bar in the shed, watching the world with those sharp, steady eyes. She thought about her grandmother, Edith Pace, who had kept her own records and pictures because no one had ever taught her to write, and who had died on a Kentucky hillside with more knowledge in her head than most educated men carried in their entire libraries. She signed her name. Wexler stood. He extended his hand across the table, and Lenora shook it, a firm, steady grip that surprised him, though by now he was beginning to understand that everything about Lenora Vale would surprise him for as long as he knew her. Mrs. Vale, he said, I believe this is going to be a very successful partnership. It will be, Lenora said, because the terms ensure that success is shared. That's the only kind that lasts. Wexler and Greer left Agnes's kitchen that afternoon in their clean carriage with the signed agreement in the leather case and the particular silence of men who have just been outmaneuvered by someone they had underestimated so profoundly that they would spend the rest of their careers wondering how they had gotten it so wrong. Agnes walked them to the gate and watched them go. When the carriage had disappeared around the bend in the road, she turned back toward the house and found Lenora standing in the doorway with the notebook in her hand and Bram beside her with his arm around her shoulder, not supporting her, not guiding her, simply standing next to her the way he had always stood next to her, as an equal who had never needed convincing. Well, Agnes said, that's done. The agreement is done, Lenora said. The work is just beginning. She stepped down from the doorway and walked across the frozen yard toward the road that led back to her own property. This large, heavy, slow-moving woman whose body had been used against her for 40 years and whose mind had just reshaped the future of an entire frontier community. Bram walked beside her. The notebook was tucked under her arm. The afternoon sun threw their shadows long and dark across the ground, and for once, for the first time in as long as either of them could remember, the shadows did not feel like burdens. They felt like proof. The following week, the town council met in the back room of the general store for the last time that winter. Edgar Marsh arrived expecting to continue his campaign to claim Lenora's notebook as a community resource. Instead, he found Agnes Rusk waiting for him with a copy of the signed agreement and a detailed account of the outbreak response that credited Lenora's methods with saving over 200 animals across 14 farms. This is settled, Edgar, Agnes told him. The method belongs to Mrs. Vale. It always did. The council's role now is to support her work, not to obstruct it. Marsh opened his mouth to argue. Agnes placed the agreement on the table in front of him. "Read it," she said. "Then decide if you want to be the man who fought against the only person in this settlement who knows how to keep our livestock alive." Marsh read the agreement. He read the production records. He read the signed statements from 7 families. And then he sat back in his chair and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. The council voted unanimously to recognize Lenora's property as the Cinder Bluff Livestock School, a formal designation that granted her operation legal standing and protected it from future attempts at seizure or closure. Agnes proposed the motion. Even Marsh voted in favor, though he did so without looking anyone in the eye. That evening, Bram began drawing plans for the new shelters. He sat at the kitchen table with a flat piece of pine board and a stick of charcoal, sketching designs based on Lenora's specifications. Airflow patterns, roosting configurations, feeding stations, isolation areas for sick animals, observation posts where students could watch and record without disturbing the flock. Lenora sat across from him, reviewing the first draft of her training curriculum. She had divided the program into 3 phases: observation, documentation, and intervention. The first phase taught students how to watch their animals, really watch them, the way Edith Pace had watched, the way Lenora watched, with patience and attention and the willingness to see what was actually there instead of what you expected to see. The second phase taught them how to record what they observed, not in the haphazard, occasional way that most farmers kept notes, but systematically, consistently, in a format that allowed patterns to emerge over time. The third phase taught them what to do with the patterns, how to identify problems before they became crises, how to intervene early, how to adjust and adapt based on results rather than assumptions. It was in its own quiet way revolutionary. Not because the individual techniques were new, farmers had been treating sick animals for centuries, but because Lenora had assembled them into a system. A teachable, repeatable, documented system that took the intuitive knowledge of women like Edith Pace and translated it into a language that anyone could learn, regardless of their background, their education, or the shape of their body. Copper sat on the windowsill of the kitchen, watching the evening settle over the valley with her sharp, amber eyes. She had been there since Lenora brought her inside an hour earlier. Not because the hen needed warmth, but because Lenora liked having her close on evenings when the work felt large and the future felt uncertain. Copper was not uncertain. Copper had never been uncertain. She had been dying in a crate, and then she had been alive in a shed, and then she had been leading a flock, and through all of it, she had watched the world with the same steady, evaluating gaze that said, "I see exactly what is happening here, and I am not afraid." Lenora reached over and stroked the feathers on Copper's back. The hen clucked once, softly, and settled deeper into her perch. "You know," Bram said without looking up from his sketch, "I never doubted you." Lenora looked at him. "I know. I didn't always understand what you were doing. When you brought those birds home, I thought, well, I didn't know what to think. But I knew you had a reason. You always have a reason." "I almost didn't buy them," Lenora said. It was the first time she had admitted this. "I stood at that fence for 20 minutes before I said a word to Poole. I counted the money 3 times. I thought about the salt. I thought about the needles. I thought about what you'd say." "What did you think I'd say?" "I thought you'd ask what my plan was." Bram smiled, the quiet, private smile that only Lenora ever saw. "And you had one. I had the beginning of one. The rest I built as I went." "That's how everything worth building gets built," Bram said. He held up the sketch. "How's this?" Lenora studied the drawing. She pointed to the airflow vents. "Wider on the east side. The prevailing wind comes from the west, so you want the intake on the east wall, and the exhaust on the west. That creates a natural cross-draft without exposing the birds to direct wind." Bram made the adjustment. He held it up again. "Better," she said. They worked in silence for a while longer. Bram sketching, Lenora writing, Copper watching, and the cabin filled with the quiet, steady energy of 2 people building something together, the way they had always built things together, without fanfare, without celebration, without any need for the world to see. The world would see soon enough. Spring came to Cinder Bluff the way it always came, not as a gift, but as a negotiation. The frost retreated inch by inch, grudgingly, leaving behind ground so saturated with snowmelt that the roads turned to rivers of mud and the creek behind the Vale property swelled to twice its winter width. The cottonwood trees along the bank showed the first pale nubs of green, tentative and unconvinced, as if the branches themselves were not entirely certain that the cold had finished with them. But the animals knew. Lenora noticed it first in Copper. The hen had spent the winter in the shed with the quiet authority of a creature that understood survival was a daily practice, not a single event. But on the first morning that the temperature climbed above freezing before sunrise, Copper walked to the door of the coop, stood in the rectangle of pale sunlight that fell across the threshold, and made a sound that Lenora had never heard from her before. A low, sustained trill that vibrated in the back of her throat and carried across the yard like a bell rung once in an empty room. Within minutes, the other 8 hens followed her outside. Lenora stood at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee in her hand and watched them move across the muddy yard. These 9 birds that had been marked for death 7 months ago, that had arrived in a broken crate pressed against the body of a woman the entire settlement had laughed at, that had been treated and recorded and nursed and observed until they became something no one in Cinderbluff had expected them to become. Proof. Proof that attention was more powerful than assumption. Proof that patience was more valuable than size. Proof that the distance between a dying animal and a thriving one was not luck or breeding or money, but knowledge. Careful, systematic, hard-won knowledge that lived in the pages of a battered notebook and the mind of a woman the world had decided to underestimate. Bram came up behind her and looked out the window over her shoulder. "They look good," he said. "They look better than good," Lenora said. "They look like what they are." "And what's that?" The beginning. Construction on the Cinderbluff Livestock School began the second week of March, when the ground had thawed enough to set posts and the days had lengthened enough to allow a full afternoon of work before dark. Bram organized a crew of 6 men, Tom Hadley, Dale Furman, and 4 others who had volunteered after the council's vote, and together they raised the frame of the new training barn on the flat piece of land between the Vale cabin and the creek. The barn was not large. Lenora had insisted on that. She wanted a structure that was manageable, practical, and designed around the principles she taught, rather than the kind of impressive facade that Eastern investors like Wexler would have preferred. The walls were solid pine, cut from timber that Bram and Hadley hauled down from the hills. The roof was pitched to shed snow and rain. The vents, wide on the east side, narrower on the west, exactly as Lenora had specified, created a natural cross-draft that kept the air moving without exposing the interior to direct wind. The interior was divided into sections. A demonstration coop where students could observe healthy birds in a properly managed environment, an isolation area for treating sick animals, a recording station with a table and chairs where students would sit and write their observations, and a small classroom space at the front where Lenora could teach. It was not fancy, it was not beautiful, but it was correct in the way that a well-built tool is correct, every element serving a purpose, every design choice reflecting something Lenora had learned through observation, experimentation, and the willingness to be wrong before she was right. Lenora designed the curriculum herself, working at the kitchen table every evening after the construction crew had gone home. She wrote in her careful, precise handwriting, filling page after page with lesson plans, observation exercises, case studies drawn from her own experience, and practical demonstrations that would allow students to apply what they learned immediately. She organized the material into 12 weeks of instruction, 3 weeks of observation, 3 weeks of documentation, 3 weeks of intervention, and 3 weeks of independent practice under her supervision. She also wrote, on a separate sheet of paper that she pinned to the wall above the table, a single sentence that would serve as the school's founding principle: watch first, record second, act third, assume nothing. Agnes arrived at the construction site on the 4th day, carrying a wooden sign she had painted herself. It read, Cinderbluff Livestock School, Este, 1888. She leaned it against the unfinished wall of the barn and stood back to look at it with the critical eye of a woman who had spent her life building things and knew how to judge whether something was solid. "Look straight," she said. Lenora, who was standing nearby reviewing Bram's work on the isolation area, looked at the sign. She looked at Agnes. 7 months ago, this woman had stood at the fence line between their properties and told Clara Dunn that Lenora's body was evidence of her incompetence. Now she was standing in the mud with paint on her fingers, contributing to the school that Lenora's body and mind had built. "Thank you," Lenora said. Agnes shrugged. "Don't thank me. I'm not doing this for charity. I'm doing this because I want to teach." Lenora studied her. "Teach? You need instructors. You can't run this school by yourself, not the classes, the demonstrations, the livestock management, the record keeping, all of it. You need people who understand the method and can teach it to others." Agnes straightened her back, that thin, rigid, unbending back that had carried 22 years of livestock experience and an equal weight of pride. "I've been keeping birds longer than anyone in this settlement. I didn't do it your way, and I was wrong about a great many things, but I know animals, and I know how to talk to people who are afraid of looking foolish, because I've been that person, and I know what it costs." Lenora was quiet for a long moment. She looked at Agnes the way she looked at everything, with patience, with attention, with the willingness to see what was actually in front of her, rather than what she expected to see. And what she saw was a woman who had earned her way to this moment through something harder than skill or experience, the willingness to change. "You start Monday," Lenora said. "First class is at 7 in the morning. Bring your own notebook." Agnes nodded once. She did not smile, because Agnes Rusk was not a woman who smiled easily, but something shifted in her expression, a loosening, a settling, the look of a person who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has finally been offered a place to set it down. The first class of the Cinder Bluff Livestock School met on a Monday morning in April, when the grass had finally turned green and the creek was running clear and the air smelled of mud and new growth and the particular kind of possibility that comes only in the spring, when the land remembers that it knows how to be alive. 12 students sat on wooden benches in the classroom area of the training barn. They were not the people Lenora had expected, or rather, they were not only the people she had expected. There were farmers, yes. Tom Hadley, who had been her first secret visitor, sat in the front row with a new notebook on his knee and a pencil behind his ear. Sarah Prescott, the widow whose coop had been letting in the north wind, sat beside him. Dale Furman was in the back, arms folded, jaw set, but present. And presence, Lenore had learned, was the first step toward everything else. But there were also people who had never kept livestock at all. A young woman named Ruth Calloway, who had arrived in Cinder Bluff 3 months ago with her 2 children and nothing else after her husband died of fever on the trail west. She had no animals, no property, no money, and no experience. But she had heard about the school, and she had walked 4 miles in the mud to sit on a wooden bench and learn something that might keep her children alive. A man named Elias Dunn, who had spent 10 years working in the mines before they closed, and had been doing odd jobs around the settlement ever since, trying to figure out what came next. He had never touched a chicken in his life, and when Lenora asked him on the first day why he had come, he said, with the particular honesty of a man who had nothing left to protect, "Because you're the only person in this town who looked at something everybody else threw away and figured out how to make it worth something. I figure if you can do that with chickens, maybe you can teach me to do it with myself." Lenora stood at the front of the classroom and looked at her students, at their faces, their hands, their notebooks, their fear and hope and uncertainty. And she felt something that she had not allowed herself to feel for a very long time. She felt seen, not looked at. People had been looking at her for 40 years, looking at her body, her size, her shape, and deciding they knew what those things meant. But this was different. These 12 people were not looking at her body. They were looking at her. At the woman who had bought 11 dying chickens with her last 12 cents and turned them into something that could change the way an entire frontier community survived. They were looking at her and seeing, perhaps for the first time, what Bram had always seen. A mind so sharp and so patient and so relentlessly attentive that it could find life in places where everyone else saw only death. "Welcome to the Cinder Bluff Livestock School," Lenora said. "I'm going to teach you how to pay attention." She taught them for 12 weeks. She taught them how to observe, how to stand still and watch an animal for 10 minutes without speaking, without moving, without deciding in advance what they were going to see. She taught them how to notice the small things, the slight change in a bird's posture that meant stress, the barely perceptible shift in a cow's drinking pattern that meant the water was wrong, the difference between a healthy scratch and an anxious scratch, between a normal silence and a dangerous one. She taught them how to document, how to write down what they saw in clear, specific language that would mean the same thing to a stranger reading it months later. She taught them to record dates, times, conditions, and outcomes. She taught them to track patterns over weeks and months, to build timelines that revealed connections invisible in any single observation. And she taught them how to act, not with the panicked urgency of someone reacting to a crisis, but with the measured confidence of someone who has watched long enough and recorded carefully enough to know exactly what the problem is and exactly what to do about it. Agnes taught beside her. The two women worked together with a complementary precision that surprised them both. Lenora providing the systematic framework, Agnes providing the practical, hands-on experience that came from 2 decades of daily work with animals. Where Lenora was patient and methodical, Agnes was direct and efficient. Where Lenora explained the theory behind a technique, Agnes demonstrated the technique itself, kneeling in the straw with her sleeves rolled up and a bird in her hands and the gruff, no-nonsense authority of a woman who had made every mistake in the book and was determined to save her students the trouble. They argued sometimes about feeding schedules, about ventilation ratios, about whether a particular set of symptoms indicated respiratory illness or nutritional deficiency. These arguments were not hostile. They were productive. The kind of arguments that happen between two competent people who respect each other enough to disagree honestly and learn from the disagreement. The students watched these arguments with fascination. Most of them had never seen two women disagree about anything more substantial than a recipe, and the sight of Lenora Vale and Agnes Rusk standing in the training barn debating the optimal roosting height for laying hens, with evidence, with data, with the passionate intensity of scholars defending their research, was a revelation that had nothing to do with chickens and everything to do with what was possible when people were allowed to be as intelligent as they actually were. Word spread. By May, families from neighboring settlements had begun arriving at the school, some on horseback, some in wagons, one family on foot after walking 16 miles from a failing homestead near the river. They came because they had heard about the woman in Cinderbluff who could save sick animals, who could make hens lay richer eggs, who could look at a struggling farm and tell you exactly what was wrong and exactly how to fix it. They also came because they had heard something else, something that mattered more than any technique or protocol. They had heard that the school did not judge, that it did not require money from those who had none, that it did not turn away widows or laborers or women or anyone else who had been told by the world that they were not qualified to learn. Ruth Calloway, who had arrived with nothing, completed the 12-week program and returned to the failing homestead she shared with another widow 2 miles west of Cinder Bluff. Using knowledge she had gained at the school, she established a small flock of 6 birds, purchased with money she earned doing laundry in town. And within 3 months, her coop was producing enough eggs to feed her family and sell the surplus at the general store. She kept a notebook. She recorded every observation, and when one of her birds showed early signs of respiratory distress, she isolated it, adjusted the ventilation in her coop, changed the feeding schedule, and treated the illness before it spread. She lost 0 birds. Elias Dunn, the former miner who had never touched a chicken, completed the program and took a position as a livestock manager at a cattle ranch 40 miles north of Cinder Bluff. The rancher who hired him later told a neighbor that Dunn was the first man he'd ever employed who actually watched the animals instead of just feeding them and hoping for the best. By the end of summer, the school had trained 37 students from 6 settlements. Continental Livestock Associates, true to the agreement Wexler had signed at Agnes's kitchen table, had begun distributing Lenora's method through a licensed program that bore her name. The first royalty payment arrived in August, $62, more money than Lenora had earned in any single transaction in her life. She used 30 of it to pay for materials to expand the training barn. She used 20 to buy supplies for students who could not afford their own notebooks and pencils. She kept $12, a number that meant something to her, that would always mean something to her, because it had started with 12 cents and a crate of dying birds, and the willingness to believe that she could see something the rest of the world had missed. The opening ceremony of the expanded school took place on a warm Saturday in September. The cottonwood trees along the creek had turned gold, and the light that fell across the valley was the thick amber light of early autumn, the kind of light that makes even ordinary places look like paintings. The settlement gathered in the yard beside the training barn. Families who had laughed at Lenora 7 months ago stood shoulder to shoulder with families she had saved. Calvin Jessup and his wife Martha were there, standing near the back with expressions that mixed discomfort with something that might, in a more generous interpretation, have been shame. Harlan Briggs was there, his arms folded, his jaw tight, but his eyes, when he looked at the training barn and the coops and the demonstration areas, carried a grudging recognition that even his considerable pride could not entirely suppress. Tom Hadley stood in the front row with his wife and 4 children. Sarah Prescott stood beside him. Dale Furman was near the fence, trying to look casual, failing. Edgar Marsh stood off to one side with his hands in his pockets, watching the proceedings with the wary attention of a man who has learned that the safest thing to do when history is moving in a direction you didn't predict is to stay quiet and stay out of the way. Agnes Rusk stood at the front, beside the barn door, wearing a clean shawl and an expression that no one in Cinderbluff had ever seen on her face before. It was not pride, exactly. It was not happiness. It was the look of a woman who has spent most of her life being certain about the wrong things and has finally, painfully, irreversibly become certain about the right ones. She addressed the crowd in a voice that carried across the yard without effort, the voice of a woman who had been speaking with authority for decades and was now, for the first time, using that authority to lift someone up instead of keeping them down. "Most of you know me," she said, "and most of you know that I have not always been kind to the woman standing beside me. I looked at Lenora Vale, and I saw what most of you saw. A large woman, a slow woman, a woman whose body I took as proof that she lacked the discipline to do the work I had spent my life doing." Agnes paused. The crowd was silent. "I was wrong. Not mistaken. Wrong. And the difference matters because mistaken means you didn't know better, and I did know better. I knew that judging a person by their appearance was unfair and unreliable. I knew it because I've spent my life being judged for being a woman in a world that assumes women don't know anything about livestock. I knew what it felt like, and I did it anyway, because it was easier to look at Lenora's body than to look at my own prejudice." She turned toward Lenora, who was standing near the barn door with Bram beside her and the notebook in her hand. "This is not luck," Agnes said. "And her body has nothing to do with the value of her mind. Lenora Vale understands what the rest of us were too proud to see. She sees what animals need. She sees what people need. And she had the courage to keep working when every person in this settlement, including me, told her she couldn't." Agnes stepped back. The crowd was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet that falls when a community is confronted with a truth it has been avoiding. And then Tom Hadley began to clap. Sarah Prescott joined him. Then Dale Furman, then Ruth Calloway, then Elias Dunn, who was visiting from the ranch and standing at the edge of the crowd with tears on his weathered face. One by one, the settlement joined, until the sound filled the yard and rose above the golden cottonwoods and drifted across the valley toward the hills. Lenora stood in front of the barn she had designed, beside the man who had never doubted her, holding the notebook that contained 2 generations of knowledge that the world had tried to ignore. And she listened to the sound of people who had once laughed at her, now acknowledging what she had always known about herself. She did not cry. She did not smile. She stood with her feet planted wide on the ground that was now legally hers, and she felt the weight of her own body. That body that had been mocked and measured and judged and dismissed for 40 years. And for the first time, the weight did not feel like a burden. It felt like an anchor. The thing that had kept her steady when everything else was trying to blow her away. After the ceremony, when the crowd had dispersed and the yard was empty, except for the lingering smell of the food that neighbors had brought and the long shadows of the autumn afternoon, Bram carried a single object from the wagon to the front of the training barn. It was a wooden plank, rough, weathered, split at one end, salvaged from the original collapsing shed where Lenore had treated her first 11 birds. He had sanded it smooth on one side and mounted a small iron bracket on the back. He hung it above the barn door without saying a word. Beneath it, he hung a second object, a small, faded cardboard sign, barely legible, with a number written on it in Poole's cramped handwriting. 12 cents. Lenora looked at the plank and the sign. She looked at Bram. And for just a moment, just one moment, in the fading light, with the cottonwood leaves falling golden around them, and the sound of copper clucking softly in the demonstration coop behind the barn, something broke open behind her eyes. Not tears, something deeper than tears. The release of a pressure that had been building for so long she had forgotten it was there. The pressure of carrying knowledge that nobody wanted, of holding value that nobody recognized, of being right in a world that had decided she was wrong before she ever opened her mouth. Bram put his arm around her. She leaned into him, all of her, the full weight of her broad, heavy, extraordinary body. And he held her the way he had always held her, completely, without effort, without reservation, as if the weight were not a burden, but a privilege. "You did it," he said. "We did it," she said. "You asked me what my plan was. That's where it started." "No," Bram said. "It started before that. It started the moment you looked at 11 dying birds and saw something nobody else could see." Copper appeared at the corner of the barn, walking with the unhurried confidence of a hen who had survived death, organized a flock, and watched a woman build an empire from a broken shed and a battered notebook. She crossed the yard, pecked once at the ground near Lenora's boot, and settled beside her, not asking for food, not seeking warmth, simply choosing, as she had chosen from the beginning, to be near the woman who had looked at her when she was sick and small and worthless, and had seen, beneath the scabs and the rattle in the half-closed eyes, exactly what she was: a survivor, a leader, something worth saving. Lenora reached down and lifted Copper into her arms. The hen settled against her chest, warm and calm and impossibly alive, and Lenora held her the way you hold something that represents everything you have fought for, gently, firmly, with the understanding that some things are not meant to be sold or traded or given away. Some things are meant to be kept. Over the years that followed, the Cinder Bluff Livestock School grew into something that none of them, not Lenora, not Bram, not Agnes, not even Wexler, had fully imagined on that day when a woman spent her last 12 cents on a crate of dying birds. The method spread across 3 territories and into 7 states, carried by students who returned to their own communities and taught their neighbors the same principles Lenora had taught them. Watch first, record second, act third. Assume nothing. The licensing income cleared the Vales' debts within a year. It secured their land. It paid for the expansion of the school, a second barn, a small library of observation journals donated by graduates, a dormitory where students who traveled from distant settlements could stay during the 12-week program. It paid for supplies for families who couldn't afford them. It paid for Lenora to travel, twice, to neighboring territories to train instructors who would establish satellite schools based on her model. Wexler's company honored every condition of the agreement, not because Dorian Wexler had become a different man, but because Lenora's records and contracts were so thorough, so precise, so meticulously documented that there was no space for exploitation. Every clause had been considered. Every contingency had been addressed. Every right had been protected, not by lawyers or legal expertise, but by the same quality that had saved 11 dying chickens and 200 settlement animals. Attention. The relentless, patient, unforgiving attention of a woman who had learned, from a grandmother who drew pictures because she couldn't write words, that the only defense against a world determined to take advantage of you was to know more than the people sitting across the table. Agnes taught at the school for the rest of her working life. She became, in the estimation of students who knew both women, as essential to the program as Lenora herself, the hard-edged, practical complement to Lenora's systematic brilliance. She never fully lost her sharpness. She never became soft or sentimental. But she became something she had never been before: honest. Honest about her mistakes, honest about her prejudices, honest about the particular cruelty of judging another person's capacity by the shape of their body. During the school's second year, a new student arrived, a young woman from a settlement 200 miles east, heavy-set, broad-shouldered, with thick arms and wide hips, and the particular expression that Lenora recognized instantly because she had worn it herself for decades. The expression of someone who is bracing for the joke, waiting for the look, preparing to be dismissed before she has said a word. Agnes saw the expression too. She walked across the yard to where the young woman was standing, extended her hand, and said, "Welcome to the Cinder Bluff Livestock School. You're going to learn more here than you ever expected, and nobody is going to judge you for anything except how hard you work and how well you pay attention." The young woman looked at Agnes. She looked at the training barn, the demonstration coop, the students moving between buildings with notebooks in their hands. She looked at Lenora, who was standing in the doorway of the main classroom with Copper on her arm, and the quiet, unshakable authority of a woman who had earned her place in the world one observation at a time. "Is that her?" the young woman whispered. "That's her," Agnes said. She looks like me. She looks like herself," Agnes said. "And so do you. Now come inside. Class starts in 10 minutes. Martha Jessup never apologized. Neither did Harlan Briggs. Some people carry their cruelties with them the way they carry old debts, acknowledging them privately perhaps, but never settling them publicly. Lenore did not seek them out. She did not demand apologies or extract confessions. She simply required of everyone who entered her school the same thing she required of herself: listen, learn, and work. Those who once mocked her began arriving with notebooks in their hands. Some came sheepishly. Some came defiantly. Some came with the complicated mixture of shame and necessity that defines the particular experience of asking for help from a person you have wronged. Lenora treated them all the same way. She did not punish. She did not gloat. She did not remind them of what they had said or done. She simply taught them, the way she taught everyone, with patience, with precision, and with the absolute expectation that they would do the work. It was in its way the most devastating response she could have offered, because it denied them the drama of confrontation, the relief of being yelled at, the comfortable narrative of the angry victim who gives you permission to feel that your cruelty was justified because look how bitter she became. Lenora did not become bitter. Lenora became indispensable, and that, the quiet, undeniable, daily reality of a woman who had been dismissed as worthless, becoming the person everyone depended on, was harder to live with than any punishment she could have devised. Copper lived at the farm for the rest of her natural life. She was never sold. She was never traded. She was never used for breeding or production or any purpose beyond the one she had assigned herself from the beginning: watching. She watched the students come and go. She watched the settlement change around her. She watched Lenora move through the years with the same slow, deliberate, unbreakable patience that had carried her through the mud on that first day with a crate of dying birds pressed against her body. When Copper finally died, quietly, on a warm spring morning in the coop she had organized and led for years, Lenora buried her behind the training barn next to the two birds who had not survived that first terrible week. She marked the spot with a flat stone from the creek and sat beside it for a long time, saying nothing, thinking about the sharp-eyed hen who had looked at her through the slats of a broken crate and seen, somehow, that the large woman staring back at her was not what the world believed. Bram found her there an hour later. He sat beside her on the ground, something his knees protested, and put his hand on hers. "She was a good bird," he said. "She was the best bird I ever knew," Lenora said. "She was dying when I found her, and she decided to live. Not because anyone told her to, because she looked around at the other birds in that crate and decided they needed her." "Sounds like someone else I know," Bram said. Lenora looked at him. She looked at the school, the barns, the coops, the students walking between buildings with notebooks and pencils, and the purposeful energy of people who are learning something that matters. She looked at the plank above the barn door and the faded 12-cent sign hanging beneath it. She looked at the settlement beyond, Cinder Bluff, this rough, stubborn, imperfect collection of wooden buildings and muddy roads, and complicated people who had once looked at her and seen nothing worth respecting. They saw her now, all of them. Not her body, not her weight, not the easy joke or the casual cruelty. They saw the woman who had transformed their frontier, who had taken the thing they were most certain about and proved, with patience and evidence and the quiet refusal to surrender, how wrong a careless judgment could be. Lenora Vale stood up. She brushed the dirt from her skirt. She picked up her notebook, the same battered, water-stained journal with the cracked leather cover that her grandmother's knowledge had filled, and her own observations had expanded into something that was changing lives across 7 states. She walked back toward the school. There were students waiting, and the morning light was good, and there was still so much to teach.